Not only did you spend money on buying a home, but you also have to do renovations in the apartment. And these are direct and meaningless expenses. From the point of view of liberal logic, you should not buy an apartment and make repairs, but give all these funds to your elderly parents or spend them entirely on educating your children. It is clear that a normal person will help parents and will not leave children alone with difficulties at a difficult moment. But any adult understands the meaning of buying an apartment and understands the meaning of renovating it. There is no way to explain these actions by economics, efficiency, or profit. Here we are talking about something else. You will leave the housing to your children and grandchildren. And you will enjoy living in a beautifully renovated home. If we follow the logic that liberals are trying to dictate to us in the situation with Crimea, we need to live on the street in a cardboard box. Everything else is a stupid waste of money. So, reunification with Crimea is the same for the country as purchasing housing for a family. This is an expansion of the territory of our civilization, our family. 7. The territory of our planet is finite. No wonder Mark Twain said a long time ago, by land, they don't produce it anymore. Any territory has mineral resources and geographical and geopolitical advantages. There are minerals in Crimea. The base of our fleet is in Crimea. Talking about how we will waste money on its maintenance is like starting to say today that it was right to give Alaska to the States. And what? They saved the budget. But it is obvious that today Alaska would not be in our way, and the minerals found there more than repay the US for the amount paid to Russia for this territory. The liberal wants the territory of Russian civilization to be as small as possible, and that of Anglo-Saxon and Western civilization to be as large as possible. 8. Surprisingly, supporters of a market economy, as liberals position themselves as such, themselves do not want to think in market categories. Why does the European Union absorb weak economies and immediately begin to subsidize them? Because by doing this he is capturing their markets and increasing the market for his campaigns. Crimea for Russia is an expansion of the market for everything possible for Russian campaigns. For some reason the liberals don't want to see an additional couple of million consumers. All over the world, states and unions are trying to expand the zone of their economic and political influence. Everywhere liberals are for, as soon as Russia does the same, all liberals, especially Russian ones, are categorically against. The goal of liberalism is to open markets around the world to the West. Therefore, the opposite must be inhibited and ridiculed in every possible way. 9. Investing money in Crimea will create jobs and give people income that will be spent in Russia. But for a liberal, the only important and correct investment of government funds is the purchase of American and European bonds. At the same time, in their economic private activities, for some reason they themselves do not invest money in treasuries, but expand their companies. They buy competitors and open branches. They are trying to occupy as large a market share as possible, to stake out as large a niche as possible. For the state, for Russia, liberals have completely different recipes than they declare in their personal, political or economic life. And the most amazing thing is that they don't notice it. Unknown snipers appeared in Simferopol. March 19, 2014. The only hope for the illegitimate Kiev junta is war. Only war will help the putschists, who came to power through bloodshed and violation of the constitution of Ukraine, to avoid punishment. They have no money, and they don't have the support of half the country either. And cutting pensions and non-payment of wages will quickly enrage those who support the putschists today. And then you will have to answer. To be responsible for the Scythian gold exported to the USA, for the organized murder of several dozen people with the help of snipers, for Ukraine, whose integrity was sacrificed only so that Yatsenyuk became prime minister not under Yanukovych, but without Yanukovych, and elections were held for several months earlier. We need a war. And they are trying to organize it. How? In the usual way. I was just in Simferopol. The blockade of Ukrainian military units looks like this. 3 polite people are walking along the street. Inside the unit there is a life of its own. Storming units after Russia has made a decision to reunite it with Crimea is complete nonsense. For what? There is no point. The Ukrainian military does not pose any danger. Crimea is now part of Russia, which Russia can and must defend. Therefore, no Ukrainian military units will fight with the whole Russian army. In conditions of almost 100% support for unity with Russia from the population. But the Kiev putschists have a reason to start a war. It makes sense for their American curators to start it too. And on Tuesday, March 18th, the morning of which I flew out of Simferopol, a sniper shot and killed a Crimean self-defense soldier and immediately shot a Ukrainian military man, 29. The Kiev junta cannot prevent the reunification of Crimea and Russia, so they are trying to start a conflict. The scheme is exactly the same as on the Maidan. An unknown sniper kills a protesting victim, and the authorities are blamed for this. In Simferopol, the role of the victim is reserved for the Ukrainian military, and the role of the bloody regime is supposedly for Russian snipers. This is a classic provocation. The goal is to provoke a clash, and then, blaming Russia for everything, try to start military action. I want to appeal to the Ukrainian military, to the Crimean self-defense forces, to the Russian military. 11. In the near future, provocations with sniper shooting at you are possible, and not only in Simferopol, but also in other places in Crimea. And also on the entry line to the peninsula. 12. Ukrainian military personnel may become the main target. The goal is to create evidence of Russian aggression, which in fact has no intention of moving anywhere or occupying anything. 13. Do not let murderers and provocateurs start a fratricidal war. This is their last chance to stay in power and escape responsibility. Chapter 4. 3 Prizes of Ukraine. 3 Prizes of Ukraine. March 28, 2014. The situation in Ukraine resembles a pendulum. It can swing in any direction, and most of all it depends on the citizens of Ukraine themselves. Today they write a lot that Ukrainian territory has become a field of geopolitical battle between the West and Russia. This is true. It was the West that brought this struggle, this fire to the territory of Ukraine. However, in addition to the common geopolitical tasks of dividing one great Slavic people, the Americans tried and are trying to fight in Ukraine for quite tangible things. The United States is interested in the 3 prizes of Ukraine. This is Crimea and the fleet base, gas pipeline, industrial areas of the southeast. These 3 prizes are why the West paid for the coup in Ukraine and turned a blind eye to the violation of the constitution. Without possessing these prizes, Ukraine is of no interest to the West. And today things look like this. 14. Crimea reunited with Russia. The West missed this prize. He failed to squeeze out the Russian fleet and deprive it of a base in Crimea in order to place his warships there. 15. The West cannot block the pipe. Russia is ready to sell the entire volume of gas to China instead of Europe. Therefore, gas blackmail, we won't let your gas in, will not work. Won't you let me in? Sit without gas. We will sell it to our Chinese comrades. Gazprom expects to conclude a long-term contract with China in May 2014, which provides for the supply of 38 billion cubic meters of gas per year to China for 30 years, Gazprom head Alexei Miller said during a meeting with Russian Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev. According to Miller, the contract is almost ready, and he expects to sign it in the near future. Miller also said that if the agreement is signed, Gazprom is ready to supply China with gas produced in Western Siberia, which is currently used to service Europe. In the future, the Russian Federation plans to increase the volume of gas supply to Asia to a level comparable to Europe, writes the Foreign Economic Relations Portal, 30. Understanding this, the principled fighters for freedom and territorial integrity of Ukraine from London begin, not finish, but rather begin, the purchase of gas from Russia. Immediately after the reunification of Russia and Crimea. That is, they understand the senselessness of gas blackmail under the new conditions. The largest British energy company Centrica, which owns British Gas, will begin direct import of Russian gas from October this year. Centrica's procurement plans remain in place despite diplomatic actions around Ukraine and their pressure on European politicians to reduce energy dependence on Russia, writes the British version of the Huffington Post, 31. 16. But for the 3rd prize of Ukraine, the struggle is just beginning. Industrial enterprises, mines, coal, minerals, it is precisely the southeast of Ukraine that is now, miraculously, not out of the news. And here it is necessary to say this: if the West is deprived of control over this third prize, then the whole of Ukraine will become uninteresting to it. He will not invest money in what he does not need. But the United States does not need the west of Ukraine. There are no minerals there, there is no naval base there, but there is a population to whom they need to pay money. The interest and concern of the United States and the European Union for the fate of Ukraine have a clear material interest. The West must control the main thing that is there. The paradox is that in order for the West to stop tormenting Ukraine, it must be deprived of control not over Kiev or Lvov, but over Donetsk and Kharkov. Having lost the third prize, the Americans can stop putting pressure on Ukraine and Russia and stop resisting Ukraine's entry into the customs union and the active integration of the one single economy. Because the alternative for them would be to constantly subsidize areas of no strategic value. But our Western friends never do anything for free and without benefit. So the fate of Ukraine today is in the hands of the population of the Southeast. The chaos and darkness can and must end. But this requires the federalization of Ukraine, which would transfer control over the industrial base into the hands of legitimate authorities. The task of the population of Southeast Ukraine is to form these legitimate authorities and achieve their goals by legal methods. The dragon guards the castle, which contains treasures. If there are no more treasures in the castle, the dragon flies away. How the West deceived Ukraine again. March 25, 2014. With the help of Arseniy Yatsenyuk and other illegitimate leaders of the Kiev authorities. To much fanfare, Europe and Ukraine signed an association agreement with the EU, which Yanukovych refused to sign in November and which allegedly caused the Euromaidan. So, no, not like this. It would seem that now, after Yanukovych was removed from power with gross violations of the Constitution of Ukraine, the time has come to sign this agreement. This is where the deception happened. What did they tell us? Yatsenyuk and the EU signed the political part of the document. The question arises, haven't we heard about any such part of this agreement before? Neither political nor any other. It's just a document, one and indivisible. And Ukraine, represented by President Yanukovych, was supposed to sign it at a meeting in Vilnius. But she didn't sign, and supposedly in response to this, the Maidan began. Where did the division of the document into parts suddenly come from? Why didn't Yatsenyuk and Europe sign the whole document, but only part of it? After all, we were told that the only obstacle on the way is Yanukovych's reluctance. In fact, on March 21, 2014, in Brussels, to loud fanfare, only a stub of the previous document was signed. No one in Brussels again said the words that many citizens of Ukraine, misled by propaganda, expected from Europeans: Ukraine will be accepted into the EU, visas to enter the EU will be cancelled for Ukrainian citizens. Who now remembers that the bloody Maidan began with the beautiful words about a stolen European dream? Why, after the fall of the bloody Yanukovych regime, do the new authorities and the EU not return this dream to Ukrainians? Because no one ever intended to accept Ukraine into the EU. Because no one was going to cancel visas. I never really intended to. Who prevented Europe from cancelling visas for Ukrainian citizens after Yushchenko's victory in 2004? Nobody. The EU did not do this. He fed us with promises and myths then, and he feeds us with the same European fairy tales today. So, let's remember that Yanukovych was persuaded to sign this agreement in Vilnius. In entirety, from the preamble to section 7 inclusive. What was signed in Brussels? Preamble of the Association Agreement, Article 1 and 3 sections, I, 2 and 7. And this piece of the former document was suddenly called the political part of the agreement. For what? To create among ordinary Ukrainians the illusion of their support from the West. The political part of the agreement could be called all part of the document except section 4, trade and trade-related issues. But in Brussels only a piece is signed. Analyzing what was signed, one of the Ukrainian journalists, who does not sympathize with Russia at all, writes: without going into the jungle of a very complex document, I will simply give the names of both the sign and the sections put aside for an indefinite time, so that it is clear what we were happy with. So, the European Union was generous with the following preamble: without the prospects for Ukraine's membership in the EU are not of particular value. Article 1 describes the purposes of the document. Section 1, General Principles. Section 2, Political Dialogue and Reforms, Political Association, Cooperation and Convergence in the Field of Foreign and Security Policy. Section 7, Institutional, General and Final Provisions. Or, what is the value of this stamp? Ambassador K. Elisiv, in an interview with Channel 5 this week, said that the political part, which will be signed on March 21st, contains provisions on guarantees of the territorial integrity, inviolability and security of Ukraine's borders. I tell you a secret, in the EU, this statement made people very tense, you know. Try to squeeze a comment on this from someone there, it's futile. All that was specific and not a blah blah dropped out of the political part, the main thing dropped out. Section 3, Justice, Freedom and Security. Section 5, Economic and Sectoral Cooperation. Section 6, Financial Cooperation and Anti-Fraud Provisions. If anyone is interested in the opinion of a person who has been writing about European integration for almost 20 years, I will say, the agreement could not be signed in this form. This is just a joke. 32. What has changed since November, the single document that Yanukovych was forced to sign in its entirety, now, it turns out, must be signed in parts. And the fact that this is a single document is recognized and recorded by both Kiev and Brussels. The final act of the summit between Ukraine and the European Union and its member states, the signatories confirm their commitment to sign and conclude sections 3, 4, V and 6 of the agreement, which together with the remaining sections constitute a single document. 33. What is known about further steps to sign this agreement? When will the remaining sections be signed? How will it be implemented, in its entirety or in parts? Cannot understand anything. And there will be no clarity. Because the West needs more fog. The West has once again cynically deceived Ukraine. Because he knows very well how illegal the current government in Kiev is. Yanukovych was a legitimate government, which is why he was persuaded to sign the entire document. And with the new authorities, nothing but empty declarations can be signed, since the illegality and insignificance of the document endorsed by the putschists can be easily proven in court. For ordinary Ukrainians, the question is also simple. Ask yourself, if you were the leaders of the West, even if you wanted to cancel visas for Ukrainian citizens, but this is not the case, would you cancel visas after the revolution? After the looting of military warehouses, the appearance of militants with automatic weapons. With the risk that all this will come to the EU? Obviously not. Therefore, after the Maidan, the abolition of visas became absolutely impossible due to simple common sense, even if all politics were put aside. Summarize. 17. The West is playing a cynical game. Its goal is to plunge Ukraine into chaos. 18. He will not provide any real assistance to Ukraine. They will give a certain amount of money on credit, but who will call a loan help? Nothing more. Only words of support. 19. The prospects for Ukrainian statehood and economy look, to put it mildly, sad. The situation is increasingly reminiscent of 1917 to 1920, chaos, banditry, lack of power and state. 10. The hopes of some Ukrainian citizens for help from the West are a consequence of media propaganda and have nothing in common with reality. The West will not help and will betray, as it betrayed everyone who was no longer needed. Awakening from illusions is always difficult. But citizens of Ukraine must understand what really happened. And this is what happened. The West, through the hands of cynical scoundrels and politicians, carried out a coup in Kiev. The purpose of the coup was to trigger the collapse of Ukraine as a state and its liquidation in its current form, squeezing Russia out of a geopolitically important point, Crimea, cartizing Russia as well with the help of Ukraine. During the coup, the West and its hirelings among Kiev politicians used unknown snipers to shoot protesters and create victims of the Yanukovych regime. Dear citizens of Ukraine, look at the faces of Yatsenyuk, Parebi, Klitschko, Tyagnerbok, Yarash, touching off. Do you really believe them? Is it possible to trust people with such faces, with such deeds, with such a reputation? Time to wake up. No one but you will save little Ukraine. There is no hope for these politicians. They will destroy Ukraine. They have already almost destroyed it. The West does not need a prosperous and free Ukraine. I would like to help build one. I could do it. But he didn't even try. He needs a huge workfield with anarchy and riots. Therefore, all pro-Western Ukrainian politicians will implement exactly this scenario. They will lie and lie and lie. And then they will run away to London, as has always been the case. It's time to get rid of European illusions. Minus dollar, plus yuan and ruble. April 7, 2014. Geopolitics is closely linked to economics. What is the root cause and what is the consequence has long been a subject of debate among experts. The peculiarity of politics is that the most important things usually go unnoticed. Because this important is often a subject of bargaining. Future or past. Therefore, the parties are not interested in attracting attention. In recent months, February and March, geopolitics has once again thrown up a few surprises. But only to those who believe that the world is divided into two parts, democratic countries that fight for all that is good, and bad countries that, accordingly, fight against all that is good. There were no surprises for realists. They knew that. 20. The United States began a policy of consistent chaos in as many regions as possible. Middle East, Ukraine, did not work out in Korea. 21. That the United States always surrenders its puppets without providing them with any real help if the situation changes. Dry rations were sent to Ukraine, and about the same thing to Georgia in 2008. 22. What the Ukrainian media call help from the IMF turns out to be loans. This is not help, this is robbery. After all, in addition to interest, loans must be repaid in the form of an increase in gas prices, an increase in the retirement age, and the curtailment of social programs. This happens wherever countries are helped by the IMF and the United States. They don't give real help, that is, free money to Ukraine. The revolution begins to devour its children. Old saying. Why did the right sector think that everything would be different for them? The revolution is over, the militants are now spoiling their view. It's curious, but when they come to power, revolutionaries always show cruelty incomparably greater than the government they overthrew. The Bolsheviks shut down demonstrations and dispersed the Constituent Assembly. They introduced execution on the spot as a punishment for many offenses. Now we see something similar. What would the right sector have done if Saakashvili had been killed in the same way during the Maidan under Yanukovych? What would the West say? And now everyone is silent, and even the investigation of the Ministry of Internal Affairs of Ukraine confirms that it is true, he shot himself in the chest. 34. Handcuffs fastened behind the back do not bother the commission. But this is not new either. Alexander Muziko, who shot himself with handcuffs on his hands, and Boris Berezovsky hanged himself with a scarf in the bathroom. Moreover, the scarf tore, unable to bear the weight. This sensational discovery was made by experts. Almost a year after the funeral. 35. In a word, in Ukraine, from a political point of view, absolutely nothing new is happening. The US is fighting Russia and China. Yes, with China. Because the weakening of Russia, the possibility of its return to the Western channel of politics is extremely dangerous for China. And China is reacting. Soft. But tough. On March 27, 2014, the Bank of England and the People's Bank of China agreed to begin settlements in yuan in London. The regulators of the two countries will sign a memorandum of understanding on March 31, the British Ministry of Finance said. This will be the first entry of the Chinese currency into the Western market. According to the Bank for International Settlements, the turnover of transactions denominated in yuan tripled in 2010 to 2013. Up to $120 billion per day, but compared to the dollar value, $4.65 trillion, it is still small. Little demand. Now it will grow. Instead of dollars, payments are made in yuan. How to understand this? Imagine the beverage market being taken over by cola. All restaurants and cafes only bottle it. In 99% of stores it is on the shelves, and it's a monopoly. And now the largest chain of hypermarkets signs an agreement, according to which on the shelves there will be not cola, but Buratino lemonade. Where it leads to a fall in demand for cola and an increase in demand for lemonade. After all, money has no taste, no smell, and it can only be advertised through armed actions against countries that do not want to use the dollar. But the United States cannot attack Great Britain. Just like Germany. After all, the leader of China came to Europe after London. March 29, 2014, the decision of Germany and China to make Frankfurt the European center for financial transactions with Chinese currency will give new impetus to trade between the two economic powers, Chinese President Xi Jinping and the German Minister of Economy said on March 29. In his speech at a Congress of Politicians and Business Leaders in Düsseldorf, Xi Jinping said that the creation of a yuan trading center in Germany represents an important step towards the internationalization of our currency. The Bundesbank and the People's Bank of China signed an agreement on March 28 to facilitate Chinese currency transactions in Frankfurt and cooperate more closely on clearing and settlement mechanisms for renminbi payments. Until now, transactions in China's currency have been impractical for all small European companies that have been able to attract China's central bank for transactions, since the yuan is not freely convertible. German Economy Minister Sigmar Gabriel says having a clearing bank in Frankfurt will help trade between the two economic powers. Our goal is an equal economic partnership, Gabriel concluded, 36. Just like that. And in Germany, read Europe, the dollar will be squeezed out. It is the dollar-euro that does not play such a role in international payments. It is cola that is being forced out. The largest restaurant chain has decided to serve only Buratino lemonade to its guests, abandoning cola. But I wonder when such statements were made in Russia. Remember, the head of VTB Andrei Kosten said that in our network of restaurants and cafes we will no longer bottle cola, but will use our own moss. Mostly. Well, we'll also use Pinocchio. Anything but Coke. Russia must sell our resources, first of all, and our products, from weapons to gas and oil for rubles, and buy goods also for rubles. Then we will take full advantage of the advantages that the ruble gives us as a convertible currency, Kosten emphasized. In his opinion, this is a very important task. We have been working towards this for a long time. I think there's a new incentive now that this is becoming a reality. I think that other banks will use settlements in rubles much more widely in the future, said the head of VTB, 37. The official reason for such a statement was US sanctions against Russia Bank. And when did the head of VTB say this? March 28, 2014. That is, just the day after the yuan reached a new level in London, and the day before the yuan in Frankfurt developed its success. But all these, of course, are random coincidences. I mean the statement by the chief state banker of Russia and the agreement signed by China and the Europeans. Of course, there is no Chinese incentive. Kosten just chose this day. Just like that, by accident. And here is the continuation. Continuation of this accident. April 2, 2014. Russia needs to immediately begin switching to settlements in rubles with all trading partners, says Andrei Kosten, head of VTB Bank. A long overdue topic is a broad transition to settlements in rubles with our trading partners, he said at the 25th Congress of the ARB. Moreover, according to him, we need to start immediately not only with settlements within the customs union and the CIS, but also in relations with our main trading partners, such as China and Western Europe. 38a. Kosten believes that the transition to ruble payments should become one of the key tasks for the banking system, the Central Bank of the Russian Federation and the government. Well, how are you going to introduce real sanctions? Buratino and the Moors are advancing, cola is beginning to lose ground. Ukraine, ball or player. April 7, 2014. After the collapse of the USSR, Ukraine became a ball in the world geopolitical football. It moves not where it needs to go, but where the players want it. However, Ukraine was previously a player within the USSR and the Russian Empire. There was a conversation about this on Posnitelny TV, 39. A. Voitenkov, Nikolai Viktorovich, how do you assess the situation with Ukraine? Ukraine was, if we take it historically, an independent state, part of the European empires, part of the powerful Soviet Union. What happened to Ukraine now? What is she part of? Or is she on her own? Is she really as independent as they say about her? And Starikov, if you constantly follow some events, what is called blur your eyes? Especially if these events are political. Various interpretations and assessments arise, a lot of emotions, behind which the essence is lost. Let's move from the political analogy to the sports one, then everything will become clear. I think that hundreds of millions of people, even billions of people in the world love football. This is a game where 22 healthy men kick one ball around the field, trying to score it into each other's goal. This game has its own rules, there are players and there is a ball. And during the game the players kick this ball mercilessly, they hit it from all sides, probably causing it extreme pain. In some situations, they can hit it so hard that it either deflates or bursts. I want to say that there is a fundamental difference between the ball and the players. The players themselves determine when to strike, where to move, how to pass, they determine their actions. The ball flies where it is directed. Nobody asks him whether he likes what gate he would like to fly into. In general, what does he, the ball, want? The football player is not puzzled by this question at all, he simply hits the ball. In politics you can either be a player or a ball, there is no third option. In today's situation, with all due respect to Ukraine, the Ukrainian people, which I consider part of the great Russian people, Ukraine is a ball. This is a geopolitical ball that geopolitical players hit from different sides, sending it in different directions, trying to score goals for each other. But it was not always so. More recently, until 1991, Ukraine was a player. It was an integral part of a great, powerful player called the Soviet Union, called Russian civilization, Russian civilization. Before that, Ukraine was an integral part of the Russian Empire, it was also a powerful player. Remember how Ukraine played then? In 1945 they scored a goal all the way to Berlin. Then they sent Gagarin into space, it was a magnificent, beautiful goal, which in its way was probably more beautiful than the goals that Pele scored. And what happened in the end? Today Ukraine is not a player, it is a subject of the game, it is a ball. This, unfortunately, is very clearly visible today, when puppets, pseudo-politicians and all kinds of politicians have brought Ukraine to a split, and in general there is a question about the existence of the Ukrainian state. You just need to remember that Ukraine was a player, and becoming a player again is not so difficult. We need to unite on the basis of the Customs Union and the Eurasian Union. Because in today's Russia, with all the problems that exist in Russia, no one can kick a ball like that. In the 90s they kicked. Now it doesn't work anymore. We become a player again. Already become a player. We will play better, we will give quality passes and we will score goals from a longer distance if Ukraine is with us, if Belarus is with us, if all the fragments of Russian civilization are with us. Therefore, Ukraine does not have such a big choice, either remain a ball that will be kicked without asking the desire of the ball itself, or become a player. And what else I would like to note, being a ball, without a player, the ball itself can never become a player. No matter what Western partners say, no matter how they shake hands, no matter how they express their respect, they will never consider Ukraine their equal. They understand only the language of force. Nobody understands any other language in politics. Therefore, from the outside everything looks beautiful, everything is in the game. A. Voitenkov, everyone is on the field. N. Starikov, everyone is on the field. A. Voitenkov, everyone is running and moving around. N. Starikov, everyone is running. 22 people are running, and the ball is also moving and running. Only in politics no one explains the rules. And the rules are as follows: 22 people in geopolitics are actually not 22 people, but less. 2. Three centers of power, they move as they need, as they want. And the ball flies to where it was sent, that's the point. Therefore, Ukraine today has one choice, to once again become a player together with Russia. So as not to remain a ball. Voitenkov, apparently, this is the kind of ball that will soon be kicked, deflated and torn. And Starikov, with a great risk that in the future, unfortunately, this ball may experience such overloads that all the air will come out of it. And the fate of balls that cannot be used to play football is generally sad, they are simply thrown away. I would like dear citizens of Ukraine to think about this. Historical rake. April 11, 2014. Watching the press conference of the chairman of the International Affairs Committee of the State Duma, head of the Russian PACE delegation Alexei Konstantinovich Pushkov brought up certain thoughts and historical parallels that I would like to share with you. What remains beyond the understanding of representatives of civilized Europe? Alexei Pushkov made the following clear. Russians in Ukraine are being subjected to cultural genocide. For more than 20 years, speakers of the Russian language and culture were subjected to forced Ukrainization and were considered second-class citizens. Russian-speaking residents of Ukraine are deprived of the opportunity to defend their right to speak and think in their native language. There is a systematic displacement of the Russian language from the educational process. The number of newspapers and television media broadcasting in Russian is being reduced, despite their enormous demand. Films in cinemas are broadcast in Ukrainian. Isn't this evidence that Russians have been and are being subjected to cultural genocide? Europeans don't see this. They are deaf and blind. Just like in the 30s, when the National Socialists led by Adolf Hitler came to power in Germany. Europe welcomed the Reich Chancellor. Europe worshipped him. And she turned a blind eye to the oppression of part of the German people, the Jews. Europe even then showed miracles of tolerance in an attempt to explain and justify the oppression of Jews. According to their version, ruined and humiliated Germany had to rally around the image of the enemy. And the Jews were designated as this enemy. And the main goal of the Reich was the cleansing of the nation. At first, Jews were subjected to cultural and religious persecution. But by the autumn of 1938, Nazi policy towards Jews had reached a stage that took the form of completely ousting them from German life. Following the order of the security police obliging Jews to wear a yellow star on their chest and back, the destruction of synagogues and the imposition of a collective fine of 1 billion marks, physical extermination began. Hitler's Germany confirmed in practice that cultural genocide is inevitably followed by physical genocide. It's only a matter of time. Today, Europeans turn a blind eye to Russian oppression in Ukraine. But can they guarantee that isolated incidents of violence against the background of mass cultural genocide will not develop into mass persecutions and pogroms in the future? Moreover, during the coup in Ukraine, power in Kiev was seized by the fascist banderates. A little later, won't the inhabitants of Europe have to apologize to the Russians, as they do now to the Jews? Europeans do not hear the voice of reason now, just as they did not then. But they were warned. As politicians from Russia are warning them today. Russia, as a special civilizational community, takes on a special mission to protect the world from the dangers that inevitably await Europe with the Nazis coming to power in a single state. Today, the source of the Nazi infection is Ukraine and its policy towards the Russian-speaking residents of the country. If today Europe does not stand up for the protection of human rights to cultural self-identification, then it will be Europe that will bear responsibility for the physical destruction of the bearers of Russian culture in neo-Nazi Ukraine. Russia will do everything possible to prevent Europe from stepping on the same historical wreck again, and condone the persecution of representatives of a separate nation. This time, Europeans are choosing the Russian people to play the role of victim. To allow this means to betray the interest of the entire Russian world. Why is it time for Yatsenyuk and Tachanov to buy a woman's dress? April 14, 2014. Any provisional government will face an unenviable fate if it acts against the interest of its people. If he has no authority. If it came to power through an armed coup. Either in 1917 or in 2014. There are no exceptions. But politicians need to know history. No other way. Yanukovych did not know that the one who chooses money, when the choice is to lose power or money, loses power, and then loses money. This is a centuries-old experience. When going into politics, you cannot remain a businessman. You need to become a politician. But for a politician, money is not a goal, but a means. Otherwise, if he strives for money, he will lose everything, and most likely his life. By the way, I think that the Kiev putschists would not have spared Viktor Yanukovych either, if they had managed to catch him. And if he had given the order to restore order, today Ukrainian statehood would not be on the verge of collapse. Those who went to the Maidan for freedom and against corruption did not know that the first result of their victory would be even greater corruption, when the oligarchs would be assigned to feed the regions, and the treasury suddenly would be completely empty. As for freedom, mobilization into the army to fight other citizens of Ukraine certainly cannot be called freedom. Those militants who, like Sashko Billy, fought against the power of Yanukovych, did not know what happened in history to those who fulfilled their function. They were eliminated. At best, they were simply deceived and sent into the shadows. You need to know history, then the future will become clear. After all, this future was already our past in a similar situation. Today, the only thing that can save Ukraine as a state is federalization. When the regions will be able to decide for themselves who will be in power, what language to speak and write, and with whom to trade. There is no other option. But the Kiev pseudo-authorities did not want to see or hear this. And they reached the point of a real popular revolt. Now Turchinov has said that a referendum on federalization can be held on May 25th. That is, simultaneously with the elections. This is complete nonsense. First you need to decide what the state will be like, and only then choose its head. And not the other way around. When going to the polls, a voter must clearly know for whom and with what powers he is voting. But the putschists deliberately confused everything. For example, not a single lawyer can answer you which constitution is currently in force in Ukraine. The old one, where the president has few powers, or the new one, which was adopted under Yanukovych, and in which the president has more rights. The fact is that on February 21st, Yanukovych was supposed to sign a law on a return to the old constitution, for which the Rada, under pressure, voted. But he was forced to run for his life and did not sign this document. Therefore, de jure, the constitution, which the putschists wanted to change, is in effect. But they pretend that the old constitution is in effect. How can you elect the head of a country with unclear powers? How can you elect the head of a country with an incomprehensible structure? How can you vote when there are fights and shootings in the streets, like in Germany in the early 30s? If you don't care about the laws and your country, as the putschists in Kiev are doing today, then, of course, it's possible. Can. But not for long. And this is another lesson from history that the poor students Turchinov and Yatsenyuk did not learn. Those who spit on their country and dance to a foreign tune have to run away in a woman's dress, as A.F. Kerensky did in 1917. Moreover, you have to flee from those who adored and applauded a few months ago. So the question is this: either a referendum on federalization is held first, and then elections, or Turchinov and Yatsenyuk can safely go shopping at a ladies' store. A.S. Alexander Fedorovich Kerensky did not flee from the Winter Palace in a woman's dress. He left in the car of the American consul, leaving his colleagues in the provisional government. This is a historical fact. But, firstly, such a flag on the hood and such a method of escape are quite suitable for modern Kiev putschists. And secondly, history always repeats itself as a farce. Therefore, I would not rule out the option of a lady's dress. Turchinov signed a decree on the start of a special operation in the east. Ukraine on air of the Russian news service. April 15, 2014. A. Tolstov, in the studio is the writer, co-chairman of the Great Fatherland Party Nikolai Starikov. Turchinov signed a decree on the start of a special operation in eastern Ukraine. Ukraine proposed to the UN to conduct a joint operation with peacekeeping forces and organizations in the east of the country. At the same time, Former Prime Minister of Ukraine Yulia Tymoshenko posted on her website a call on the leaders of all states to apply the third level of sanctions to the Russian state. In particular, he asked for direct military assistance to the Ukrainian people. Representatives of the People's Militia appealed to Vladimir Putin with a request to protect them, and Russian Interior Minister Sergei Lavrov stated that our country does not interfere in the internal affairs of Ukraine. This is contrary to our interest. Russia also stands for an integral and united Ukraine. So what conclusion can we draw? The West and Ukraine feared a military operation on the part of Russia, and now they are actually announcing the possibility of using the army on their part. How should we react to these statements? And Starikov, you know, it would be funny if it weren't so sad. Because you and I see that on the Russian side there are politicians with a capital P, who carefully, weighing every word, make their statements, and in no case try to rattle weapons. On the other hand, they are clowns, it's hard to say otherwise. But, unfortunately, these clowns can shed blood. And then this story becomes no longer funny. Constant talk of the Ukrainian leadership about the use of force, the third ultimatum in 2 days, the most recent, the signing of an anti-terrorist operation. Let's remember that Yanukovych, who is accused, who was deprived of power, did not sign such a decree. He didn't want to use violence. You can condemn him for this, he did the right thing or not. But, nevertheless, now we see that the victorious Knights of Freedom, all in white, are ready to fill their entire white uniform with blood. This is, unfortunately, terrible. But every revolution, I, as a person who has written several books on this topic, can say, always ends this way. A. Tolstov, why are these statements being made now? Why not earlier? N. Starikov, because the situation has been brought to the boiling point. The people of the southeast of Ukraine, and I think that probably the majority of Ukrainians, they do not accept this power, which, firstly, came illegally in Kiev as a result of a military coup. And secondly, they cannot simply live with Bandera becoming a national hero. And that's why people don't want to live like that. They are not heard. They demand federalization. And this popular cry really grew into a popular revolt. And instead of talking to our people, announcing a referendum on federalization, holding it instead of presidential elections, I can now explain why this should be done. We hear constant calls to shed blood from all sides. This is not normal. A. Tolstov, regarding the referendum. Statements are made by the same Turchinov that an all-Ukrainian referendum on the issue of government structure can be held simultaneously with the elections on May 25th. True, if the Rada makes such a decision. And Starikov, anyone who has seen Turchinov's face will not listen carefully to his statements. What I want to say is this, why can't it be done at the same time? The fact is that a very interesting situation is happening in Ukraine today. Not a single lawyer can explain to you which constitution of Ukraine is in force. Let me explain. During the time of Viktor Yanukovych, under him, as they say, they changed the constitution and added powers to the president. It was this constitution that the putschists wanted to return to its old form. On February 21st, when all the agreements that the opposition violated were signed, Viktor Yanukovych did not have time to sign one document because he was forced to save his life. As we see today, this threat was real. He had to sign the final document, which the Rada very quickly voted for. Only after Yanukovych signed this document did the old constitution of Ukraine come into force. He didn't sign. This means the new one is in effect. But the new one says completely different things. And the current putschists act as if the old one were acting. That is, it is generally incomprehensible, a constitutional vacuum. Because, according to the old version, they make appointments and act, that's the first thing. We need to look into this issue. Secondly, Ukrainian citizens will go to elect a president. What powers will this president have? According to one constitution there are some, according to another, others. And third, what is federalization? This is a change in the powers of the center and regions. That is, how can you choose a president if at the same time the principle of how the country is built can change? We must first decide what Ukraine is. Is it a federation? Is it a unitary state, or is it something else? And only after this can the leader of this country be chosen. It is obvious. A toast of, but there are also statements that the elections should be postponed to the fall. Before that, adopt the constitution, these changes, that is, return to the old constitution. And Starikov, for me personally, human life seems to be the most important value in this world. Look what the putschists and those who were on the Maidan achieved. 100 people gave their lives. There is a threat that more people will die. In order for the presidential elections in Ukraine to take place in May 2014 instead of March 2015. Ask yourself, was it worth it? Did it really cost 100 human lives, chaos, anarchy, the threat of the collapse of the country, so that elections could be held 11 months earlier? A toast of question from Alexander: if there is a junta in Kiev, then why doesn't Russia protect the Russian people? Where is the logic, and what does Ukraine's sovereignty have to do with it? Yanukovych must allow the entry of Russian troops. And Starikov, the question is quite reasonable. To be honest, these are just emotions. The listener believes that Yanukovych should allow the entry of troops into the territory of Ukraine. But Yanukovych doesn't think so. And what to do with it? Will a respected radio listener sign this decree instead of Yanukovych? Will he speak at the UN instead of Yanukovych? Instead of Yanukovych, will he explain and interpret international legislation? Of course not. Russia's position is balanced. Our main position is based on two postulates. 1. In order not to give the opportunity to start a war under any circumstances. 2. We need a whole, developing, thriving Ukraine. We don't need the collapse of Ukraine. The president speaks about this, Lavrov speaks about this. To the best of my modest strength, I also talk about this constantly. Why? Because the Americans deliberately created this whole mess, destroying the Ukrainian state with the hands of the putschists, so that there would be a huge field next to our borders, just like in 1818, the Moknovshchina was continuous. So that this field would provide an opportunity for extremist organizations, so that a huge number of people would lose their jobs, they could be attracted to some extremist organizations so that all enterprises there would be closed. Look what the Ukrainian leadership is delegating now. They are going to stop supplying arms to Russia. Question: who else buys weapons from Ukraine? The main buyer is not Ukraine, but Russia. Ukraine itself buys almost nothing from Ukraine. There are also foreign consumers. That is, let's frostbite the ears so that the mother-in-law has a son-in-law without ears. That is, if they stop supplying some components for our military enterprises, their enterprises will close. People will be left without work. What is the point of this action? There is no point. We must understand that all the actions of the Kiev putschists are not independent. They act in such a way as to annoy Russia as much as possible. Based on this understanding, you need to build your policy. They need war. They constantly arrange provocations. Look at the situation in the city of Slovyansk, where unknown people in civilian clothes, in training suits, shot 2 cars with people. 1 was killed, 2 were wounded. Question: what is this? I'll answer you. This is the technology of the same unknown snipers, only in a different version. There is nowhere for snipers to shoot, so people in cars shoot at other people in cars. The same thing happened in Syria before the start of a full-scale civil war, when unknown people on motorcycles shot protesters with machine guns. The task is to cause clashes, heighten passions, and bring this cauldron to an explosion. Therefore, someone needs war, someone needs sacrifices. This someone is the USA. Understanding this, Russia should not give an excuse, should not send troops there. A toast of, another question from a listener: what are the grounds for calling the government of Ukraine illegitimate if it is recognized by the majority of UN countries? And Starikov, very simple. Firstly, it is bitter that most countries of the UN, PACE, and other international structures act on the principle even if he is a scoundrel, he is our scoundrel. The reasons are very simple. We opened the Constitution of Ukraine, both the old version and the new. There are clearly written three options in which the president of Ukraine can be deprived of power. 1. He wrote a statement. 2. He died. 3. Went through an impeachment procedure. Impeachment proceedings are not simply about lawmakers standing up and voting. Firstly, there must be a certain number of these deputies. A special commission is created to investigate those crimes on the basis of which impeachment is declared. She conducts an investigation not in 2 hours, not in 15 minutes, but many months. Then he reports. The constitutional majority of deputies is already voting. After this decision must be endorsed by the Constitutional Court. That's when the impeachment procedure took place. What did the putschists do? I think that radio listeners understand that this procedure has not even been started at all. Moreover, they also dissolved the Constitutional Court. So, Viktor Yanukovych, according to the Constitution of Ukraine, is the legal, legitimate president of Ukraine. And the fact that the UN votes the way the Americans tell them is time to stop being surprised by this process. Tolstov, why then does Ukraine propose to the UN to conduct a joint operation with the organization's peacekeeping forces in the east of the country, and does not turn to NATO with the same question? Starikov, because it's all a circus. These are the same bloody clowns. NATO will not provide any assistance to Ukraine. Remember the classic Vladimir Semyonovich Vysotsky, we will write in Spotlotto. This is the same thing. They are just as likely to write to the Wildlife Trust. Their task is not to save Ukraine, but to annoy Russia. That is, they sowed chaos in Ukraine so that Russia would be drawn into this chaos in one form or another, so that a war would break out between Ukraine and Russia. And we need a prosperous Ukraine, and a holistic one, if one can use such an adjective. Therefore, when someone talks about the introduction of troops in Lugansk, Donetsk, and other regions, think about it. And in the Lviv region, and in the Zhytomyr region. Are they waiting for the Russian army there too? No. So how can you talk about this? I understand why the radio listener writes this way. He was driven by emotions. The leader of the country cannot act like this. It is very good that the country is headed by a politician who does not take his steps in the heat of emotion, but thinks them through very well. That's why the results are so wonderful. Look, Crimea has reunited with Russia. There was no deployment of troops there. The result has been achieved. Here's how to proceed. Tolstov, and even today messages came that a rally was taking place on the Maidan against the new government of Ukraine. The requirements are as follows: to stabilize, first of all, the economic situation. If this does not happen, the country will be overwhelmed by mass protests. Over the past week, life in Ukraine has become unbearable, say participants in this action. Groceries have doubled in price, medicines have risen in price by 50%, the same thing is happening with housing and communal services and gas tariffs. Travel in Kiev by minibuses has also almost doubled. What could such rallies lead to on the same Maidan Nezalezhnosti? The quality of life is deteriorating. Could serious opposition to the current government emerge? What would this change in the minds of those people who advocated European integration and the overthrow of Yanukovych? And Starikov, remember the classic of Soviet cinema, Wedding in Malinovka, the power is changing again. There, about the issue of money, it was, take it, I'll draw more. And about how resources are divided, this is for me again, it's all the same to me. The entire current Ukrainian situation is described there. If the government acts this way, and it cannot act otherwise, after a while those who supported it will themselves sweep it away. Because they, naive people, were misled into thinking that they were achieving something good. They themselves destroyed their state with all the consequences in a few months. The collapse of a state is always scary for the people. This is always an economic crisis, it is always the danger of civil war, it is always a decline in living standards. It never happens that the state collapses and everyone begins to live well. It doesn't happen that way. Remember the Soviet Union, how it ends. Now this tragedy is happening on a smaller scale, but that doesn't stop it from being a tragedy. Therefore, the Ukrainians themselves must reject the current illegitimate Ukrainian government. And in a few months, not years, the Ukrainians themselves would definitely drive her out. Because she won't keep any of the promises she made. Listener, hello. Mr. Starikov, as a historian and writer, you should know what Ilian wrote. Remember that when the Communist Party collapses, then if an anti-people dictatorship comes to power, it will take decades to create a state. After the terrible revolution of 1818, Stalin managed to raise the country. In a short time he raised and won all the wars. And we have been in this swamp for 25 years. We have a civil war going on in Russia, don't you see? How long will this continue, do you think? And Starikov, look, a person is calling who sincerely supports the country. I see. And again an outburst of emotions. I know history very well, dear radio listener. I have already written 12 books. Some of them are devoted to the history of the revolution. One of them is called Stalin. Let's remember together. I have great respect for Stalin. But Stalin and his team, which restored the country, are not the same people who destroyed Russia in 17 to 18. Moreover, the so-called Leninist Guard in 1937 to 38 received what they deserved in full. Only after this was the Soviet Union finally able to move forward, win the most terrible war and become a superpower in full until Gorbachev betrayed it in 1991. What are you offering? Will the country be flooded with blood again as a result of another civil war? Of course not. Therefore, this is not the way for the development of Ukraine. When I say that any revolution leads to the fall of statehood, bloodshed, this is so. Remember the Great French Revolution. It is necessary to distinguish the Soviet Union of the 70th year from the bloody orgy and civil war of the 19th year. These are two different countries. Although the parties seem to be similar in name, they are different communists, different ideologies, different meanings. Therefore, we will have enough revolutions. And that's why we don't want revolutions to happen in Ukraine. It was the coup d'etat, which when it wins, calls itself a revolution, that destroyed today's Ukraine. It is a fact. Before February 21st, before the start of all these events, neither Crimea nor Donbass had the slightest desire to secede from Ukraine. To understand what we are talking about, let's imagine hypothetically. In 1999, Bosayev's gangs went to Dagestan. The Dagestanis immediately, even before the approach of our armed forces, repulsed them. Many thanks to them for this. Russia remembers their feat, but imagine that something terrible happened and Bosayev's campaign ended on Red Square. That's it, they won and became the central government. I assure you that all regions of Russia would immediately want to secede from this central government. Moreover, even those regions with a Muslim population. Because such Wahhabi extremists in power are terrible. This is what is happening in Ukraine today. Fascists, nationalists and politicians working in the interest of the West came to power there. And everyone else is horrified and wants to distance themselves from them. The source of the collapse of Ukraine is the current Kiev government. The desire of all normal people is to be away from her. Therefore, if this Kiev government comes into contact with its people, if referendums on federalization are held there and the meaning of power in Kiev changes, then Ukraine can be saved. Tolstov, Nikolai Viktorovich, they are asking you about your statement that Russia does not send its troops into the territories of countries. Roman writes, excuse me, please, but Russia did not send troops into Yugoslavia, Syria, or North African countries, and, nevertheless, there is war and devastation there. What's the point in being careful? And our other listener, how not to interfere? Leave our Russian compatriots to die. Let them shoot, or what? N. Starikov, first question, who was shot? At the moment, Russia's tough position on preventing these excesses, it lies not in the tanks that are traveling there, but in the diplomatic position, which has led to the fact that Kiev has already issued 3 ultimatums and cannot decide on anything. I never made up my mind in Crimea. They are always trying to make provocations. Remember the sniper in Simferopol who shot 1 Ukrainian soldier and 1 Cossack? Now some people are shooting at cars. They need a reason, they need a war. Dear radio listeners, let's think, I understand that this is difficult, but not with emotions. They need war, we need peace. Therefore, we must achieve the same goals, but only with different methods. As for the fact that there is a war going on in Syria, do you see the difference between Syria and Libya? Russia did not interfere in Libya, Russia did not interfere in Yugoslavia. There is no Yugoslavia, there is no Libya either. There, some hooligans recently arrested the Prime Minister because he behaved badly. This is the level of today's Libyan state. But Syria exists. Yes, there is devastation there. Yes, there are dead people there. Because there the people defend their freedom against terrorists. Do you see the difference? And he would not have defended his freedom if Russia had not helped him. Therefore, let's figure out what kind of policy is being pursued and what results it leads to. Listener, Nikolai Viktorovich, you said why it was necessary to carry out this coup with subsequent re-elections. From my point of view, this coup was made in order to greatly lower the rating of Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin. If there had been bloodshed in Crimea, bloodshed in eastern Ukraine, then the people simply would not forgive Putin, and he would no longer become president. Everything has been done for this. And plus the Olympics, to denigrate it. How do you think? And Starikov, when the West began these actions, it pursued quite a lot of goals, but they were all equally anti-Russian. You are absolutely right that the coup was originally planned, and Putin himself spoke about this, for 2015, when the next presidential elections in Ukraine were supposed to take place. But since Yanukovych did not sign the agreement on European integration, please note, everyone has already forgotten about this agreement. No one is demanding that the European dream for which he came to the Maidan be returned to him, because they are not even close to the European dream. Food has already become more expensive. Gasoline has become more expensive, no medicines, no work. What kind of European dream is there? So, only after Yanukovych did not sign this agreement did the putschists have to improvise. And they have many goals. Firstly, to sow chaos. Secondly, to deprive Russia of a strategic base in Crimea and, of course, to put the Russian leadership in a difficult position. That is, if you do not fight for Crimea, then you are showing weakness and losing your rating within Russia. Especially if it happens with bloody excesses. If you interfere in these bloody excesses, you lose your rating because you intervened in the bloody excesses. Remember 1914. What a patriotic enthusiasm. Everyone wants to defend Russia, which Germany declared war on. And in 1917, who overthrew the Ardennes? Where did this patriotic enthusiasm go? This happened because 3 years of war led to a change in people's attitude towards what was happening. That is, the West wanted to drive us into a very difficult situation. And this is the skill of a politician to achieve a goal opposite to what the enemy set for himself, and at the same time avoid all the pitfalls. The main thing is that no blood was spilled. 2 people died. Very sorry. Perhaps the streets should be named after them. Of course, they will name it in Crimea. Tolstov, from your point of view, until what point will Russia not interfere in the situation? Where is the point after which this will no longer be possible? And Starikov, Russia will not interfere until events are completely out of control. If some kind of, God forbid, war of all against all begins in Ukraine, then, of course, it will be necessary to react to this in some way. I really hope that the Ukrainian people themselves will be able to resolve this situation. Please note that the process of transition of both the police and military to the side of the people has now begun. This is an inevitable path, because no one can shoot at ordinary people, only the fascists from the right sector, who are now called the National Guard. Imagine an airborne brigade. What, is she going to shoot women and old people? What for? She will simply step aside, and at best, go over to the side of the residents. Tolstov, Nikolai Viktorovich, question, why then did Putin ask for permission to use military force if there would be no deployment of troops? And Starikov, he asked for this in order to demonstrate Russia's determination. You know that the threat used is no longer a threat. Please note that no one has revoked this permission, it is no longer discussed. But quite a lot of time has passed. I think a month has passed since then. And the Ukrainian putschists, by and large, have not yet used force. Although they created a lot of reasons for this. Most importantly, they constantly said that they had this reason and that they would use force. That is, they constantly talk, but something stops them at the last moment. Certainly not the visit of the head of the CIA, which took place the other day. Tolstov, this is also an interesting question. Today we received messages about Russian gas. Ukraine is ready to pay $386 per 1,000 cubic meters. Russia previously insisted on a price of $485.50. Europe is also talking about plans to create a single energy union. This organization can deal with issues of natural resources. In general, this is not the first time that energy issues have been raised. From your point of view, would the current situation push Europe to resolve this issue so as not to depend on Russia? What will happen if Europe and the European Union refuse Russian gas? And Starikov, this question is worth commenting on. Statement from Ukraine, it is ready to pay $386 for gas. Imagine, dear radio listeners, you come to a store, go up to the counter and say, I'm ready to pay 500 rubles for this sausage. The seller tells you, but it costs 600. And you say, I don't care. I'm ready to pay 500 for it, which means you are obliged to sell it to me for 500 rubles. So, what? Well, this is a kindergarten. Despite the fact that there is a signed contract where the price is fixed, for which Yulia Tymoshenko became a prisoner of conscience for several years. There is a contract, everything is described there, the price, ways to reduce it in case of some things, prepayment if they don't pay for a long time. Everything is written there, you need to read the contract. Therefore, talking about the fact that we want to pay some price is talking in favor of the poor. And in a situation where an illegitimate government in Kiev is in power, Russia has no motivation to subsidize this government and reduce the price of gas. We lowered the price for Yanukovych because he was legitimate and pensions were paid under him, and the hryvnia exchange rate was different, and fascists did not walk on the streets with machine guns. We gave him a discount for not signing this agreement. This was understandable. Why are they giving this discount? Because they are putschists, and because they are recognized by some UN countries. Let these UN countries give them this money. I arrived from Slovakia today. Therefore, I also know the situation regarding gas from the other side. After all, Slovakia is one of the countries for which Ukraine, for reasons unknown to Slovakia, has great hopes. What does Ukraine want? She wants some kind of gas reversal to be carried out in Slovakia. Imagine there is a gas pipeline, gas goes to Europe. By some physical miracle, the gas should return back through the same pipe. It is clear that we are talking about Ukraine taking our gas, but it is considered as if Slovakia supplied it. Everything would be fine, but Slovakia asks the question, who will pay for this gas? Here the Ukrainian partners cannot say anything. Therefore, Slovakia says that gas reversal is impossible, but it is ready for some supplies if the European Union gives guarantees that it will pay for this gas instead of Ukraine. But the European Union does not provide such guarantees. Look, it's just talk. What specific help from the West? Now the United States has provided $1 billion in aid, this is a loan, it will have to be repaid. The IMF gives politically motivated loans, pensions should be lowered, the retirement age should be increased, social benefits should be reduced, then we will give money so that you can return more money to us later. Is this help, or what? Nobody is helping Ukraine. Because they don't need a prosperous Ukraine, but for Ukraine to be very bad. And they say one thing, but put their plan into action. Therefore, talk from Europe that they will be more independent of Russian gas is also a complete fiction. Firstly, in order to be independent, we need to replace our gas with something. Norway cannot provide such a replacement. She has no volumes. The US produces shale gas. Firstly, it needs to be transported, but there are no huge ships into which liquefied gas is pumped, there are no berths in Europe, there is not even a shipbuilding program for construction. That is, in 10 years, maybe they will bring it. But these 10 years need to be warmed up with something. Not only Angela Merkel's statements, or Arsen Avakov's Facebook post, but something more significant. Europe cannot replace Russian gas with anything. It is expensive, time-consuming and unprofitable. Tolstov, at the same time, Deputy Prime Minister Arkady Dvorkovich, who returned from China, declares that his Russian and Chinese colleagues are ready to prepare a contract for the supply of Russian gas to China. Moreover, these proposals could be prepared for President Vladimir Putin's visit to China as early as May. How interesting is this market for us? What prospect does Russia have in China? And Starikov, of course, this market is very interesting for us. It was not by chance that we built a gas pipeline there, in an attempt to discredit which the greatest thinker of our time made a name for himself, who now languishes without the internet, poor, unhappy. And it is no coincidence that he tried to prevent exactly this, the construction of the ESPO, which leads our hydrocarbons to China. There are a lot of advantages here, but one disadvantage. The advantages are that if Europe suddenly makes a suicidal desire to bask in the trees that grow on their streets, we say, okay, guys, no problem. But we will supply gas to China. The only downside is that China cannot yet provide us with the same level of consumption as Europe consumes. Tolstov, and in this regard, a question from a listener, who will be Russia's ally if a conflict arises with China, if the UN has recognized Russia as an aggressor? N. Starikov, and whoever was a voluntary ally of Russia, so much so that he fought for us better than ourselves, or at least like us. I don't know anything like this in history at all. We need to start from a simple understanding. There are no allies who would be as loyal to Russia and love her as much as we ourselves. The skill of diplomats lies in weaving a web of respect for interests so that China benefits from being friends with Russia and not from conflict. So that Italian politicians can see that cooperation with Russia is much more profitable than any conflicts. That is why the West has been trying for a long time to bring politicians to key European countries who will act to the detriment of their country, like Adolf Hitler. Or like today's putschists in Ukraine, who say that they love Ukraine very much, but in fact they began to crush, chop and ruin it. Tolstov, when will we switch to rubles in settlements with Ukraine? N. Starikov, good question. It is necessary to switch to ruble payments not only with Ukraine, but in general in the trade of our natural, and not only natural, resources. Then, strictly speaking, the process will go quickly and fun. But if, for example, it is difficult for us to sell the product of our mechanical engineering for rubles, then it is impossible not to buy our gas. Or, for example, our Finnish partners cannot help but buy Russian timber. Whether you want it or not, that's a different story. Cannot. Therefore, we can set a condition, yes, we sell, but only for rubles. Come to our exchange, sell your currency, buy rubles, and pay with them. That is, the meaning of all this in a nutshell is to create demand for our national currency. By creating demand for dollars, the United States achieved a high standard of living. As soon as we move on to trading for rubles in as wide a range of goods as possible, we can do the same here in Russia. Listener, Nikolai Viktorovich, you admit that our enemy, that is, the United States, whose intelligence operates freely on the territory of Ukraine, also thinks and also sees what the Russian leadership wants and how it acts. And, Starikov, of course, intelligence services are working. As a matter of fact, the SBU was under the Americans before, but now it is a direct branch. Look, today the head of the SBU, who was overthrown and dismissed along with Yanukovych, made a sensational statement. He said that Nalyvaichenko, the current head of the SBU and the head of the Central Election Commission, is a double agent. Nalyvaichenko works for both British and American partners. In principle, nothing surprising. When I began to study the question of where the right sector came from, I suddenly saw that Mr. Nalyvaichenko came to their camps as the head of the SBU. Imagine, this whole story was covered up. There are photos on the internet. For example, the graduation of cadets from the School of the Security Service of Ukraine. The American ambassador presents them with diplomas. This is not the FBI, not the CIA, but the SBU. Can you imagine the Russian ambassador presenting promising young FBI agents with some souvenirs, nesting dolls, pennants? Of course not, no one will let him in there. Therefore, the situation is this: Americans are working in Ukraine. The head of the CIA came there. But they have worked in Ukraine before, and have always worked. And the operation called reunification of Russia and Crimea was a complete surprise for them. They did not expect that the Crimeans would be able to organize themselves like this. They did not expect Russia to show will on this issue. They generally expected a completely different development of events. That's why we managed to surprise them. And I see no reason why we won't be able to do this in the future. Listener, why do you say that we need a united Ukraine? We don't need her at all. There are incompatible things there: Galicians, Uniats, Rusins, Transcarpathians. And ordinary Ukrainians are Russians. Why should Ukraine be united? Why should this package include peoples so opposite in interest and quality? Unclear. And Starikov, I want to say that I don't divide peoples by quality and quantity. For me, all Ukrainians are equal. For me, a Ukrainian is the same Russian who has slight peculiarities in his dialect, which also exist in the southern regions of Russia. There is no big difference. Remember what Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev said. He had nothing to do with Ukraine, nevertheless, he had an absolutely Ukrainian, southern Russian dialect. Yes, there is a definite problem that the western regions of Ukraine are mentally different. They have especially become mentally different over the last 20 years. But we must understand that, strictly speaking, they entered our Russian civilization only thanks to Stalin in the middle of the 20th century. It takes time for this antagonism not between Russians and Ukrainians, but for the antagonism between the Russian world and the Western world, that's the problem there, for this antagonism to go away. We, patriots of the Russian world, need all of Ukraine, prosperous and united. It seems to me that our point of view should be this: we cannot divide what is part of us. Another thing is that circumstances that we do not always determine lead to the disintegration of an entire country. And then some actions are already carried out. But we cannot and should not initiate this process. The ultimate goal of NATO is to admit the Tver region of Russia into this organization as a separate state. April 21, 2014. In a telephone interview with the Nokanun.ru resource, I expressed my point of view on the results of the Geneva negotiations and the situation in Ukraine as a whole. 40. Question: the day before, four-party negotiations on the situation in Ukraine were held in Geneva. Nikolai Viktorovich, in your opinion, were they successful for Russia? And Starikov, negotiations exist so that the parties can discuss the problems that concern them and find a peaceful solution. The very fact of the negotiations suggests that the situation in Ukraine vaguely resembles the scales, and they do not swing in one direction or the other. If one of the parties to the conflict, which today is purely Ukrainian, had the opportunity to resolve it unilaterally, I am sure that everything would have already been decided. Those who today call themselves the legitimate authorities in Kiev, given the opportunity, would suppress with a strong hand the uprisings of their people in the southeast. But they do not have such an opportunity, so both Kiev and the United States have to sit down at the negotiating table. As for the results of these negotiations, there is nothing special to brag about. In a nutshell, they agreed to negotiate. Because what has now been signed in Geneva is a collection of good wishes. One side must vacate the buildings and surrender weapons, the other must disarm the illegal formations of the right sector and stop attacks on people. In addition, the main question has not been resolved: what should be the way out of the constitutional impasse into which the February putschists led Ukraine? Here, each side has a completely different view of how to get out of this impasse. It seems to me that the path proposed by Russia is correct. That is, first we need to decide on the rights of people, what rights the regions will receive, and hold referendums in the regions. At the same time, it is important that they be in the regions, and not throughout the country. I don't think that the residents of Donetsk or Mariupol trust the Central Election Commission of Ukraine, in which, according to the latest information, British agents sit. And only after this, When it becomes clear what kind of country this is, what kind of constitutional system it has, what kind of constitution it has, will it be possible to elect the head of the country? Otherwise, accelerated elections are proposed for an unknown country, with unknown powers. That's not how it's done. Question: in your opinion, will something change now? Will the people really vacate government buildings? And Starikov, in order for people who were driven to carry out such actions to disarm and leave certain buildings, they must receive guarantees of carrying out what the people took to the streets for. Is someone today suggesting they hold regional referendums? I haven't heard such statements from Kiev politicians. Does anyone guarantee that they will restore order in the country and disarm neo-Nazi groups? I haven't heard about this either. Until there is clarity on these issues, I am afraid that the document signed in Geneva will remain a document signed in Geneva. Question: could this document give another reason for the Kiev junta to suppress the rebels using force, in case the people do not want to leave government buildings? And Starikov, Ukraine tries to do this all the time, but it doesn't succeed very well. In addition, the most important deterrent for the Kiev authorities is not the absence of any signed papers, but the presence of permission from the Federation Council to use Russian armed forces in the event of unprecedented events in the territories bordering us. Therefore, there is no need to attach great importance to the papers that are signed in Geneva. At one time, Hitler and I signed a non-aggression pact, but he immediately violated it. Question: following the negotiations, U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry stated that Washington is ready to soon introduce additional sanctions against the Russian Federation if it does not see progress in resolving the Ukrainian problem. And Starikov, I really want that in 10 years, at such negotiations, Russia will announce the introduction of sanctions against the United States if the United States behaves badly. Kerry's statement is, to put it mildly, strange. Here either you are reaching an agreement with us, or you are trying to put pressure on us. One must exclude the other. Question: how likely is it that America will expand sanctions against Russia in the near future? And Starikov, of course, it will expand. Instead of 21 people, they will freeze the non-existent account of 41. This will be a terrible blow to the Russian economy. Question: how do you feel about the promise of the head of the Ukrainian Foreign Ministry that the Kiev authorities will carry out a transparent constitutional reform in the country? And Starikov, as a child, I read a lot of Krulov's fables. They told about various characters of flora and fauna who made different promises, but did not fulfill them. So, I don't think there is any reason to trust the government, which cannot explain why it violated the agreement with President Yanukovych, who gave them power, and carried out a coup in Kiev in just a few hours. If they wanted stabilization and democratic development of Ukraine, they would have already received everything from Yanukovych. But they, or rather those who control them, need chaos, a divided Ukraine and war. That is why the putschists carried out a coup d'etat without any need. When Viktor Yanukovych appointed the same Yatsenyuk as prime minister, he could have performed his functions in the same way, only now it would not have been Turchinov standing behind him with incomprehensible legitimacy, but a completely legitimate President Yanukovych. Question: it's interesting that the West is demanding that Russia stop the escalation of the conflict in Ukraine, but at the same time Rasmussen says that no one should force Ukraine to be a neutral party. Isn't this how our neighbors aggravate the situation in Ukraine? And Starikov, the West always demands something from Russia. As soon as we became a more or less visible country, they immediately began to demand something from us. Starting from the fact that we did not offend the poor defenseless Swedes, whom we defeated and from whom we took the entire Baltic coast, ending with the fact that our European partners demanded that we unilaterally start a war with Hitler without any guarantees on their part. And then they were very offended when instead we concluded a non-aggression pact with him. They always demand something from us. We need to stop paying so much attention to their demands and focus on our own interest. Question: still, in your opinion, why is NATO making a statement that Ukraine may not be a neutral country? And Starikov, this is another move. No one will accept Ukraine into NATO now, or into other European structures. If we give up our positions one by one, then there is such a possibility. But you need to understand that the ultimate goal of NATO is to admit into this organization the absolutely democratic and free region of Russia as a separate state with a powerful army of 20 people. The Americans need Ukraine as part of Russia, which they would then set against Russia. April 22, 2014. I bring to your attention a recording of the RSM broadcast with my participation on April 21, 2014. Transcript of the program, spelling and punctuation, ISN. A. Tolstov, in the St. Petersburg studio of the Russian News Service, writer and co-chairman of the Great Fatherland Party Nikolai Starikov. A people's governor was elected on Freedom Square in Kharkov. It was local businessman Vladimir Varshavsky. In addition, at a Congress of Representatives of People's Gatherings in Lugansk, Governor Valery Boletov was elected. Next, the militia leaders in Slavyansk met with OSC representatives. There is also a people's mayor there. This is Vyacheslav Ponomarev. He was chosen a little earlier. However, the situation in Donetsk and Lugansk remains quite tense. A curfew has been introduced in the city. On Sunday night there was a shootout at a checkpoint in Slavyansk, which led to casualties. What do all these messages mean to you? And Starikov, this is all a logical consequence of the fact that the state in Ukraine was virtually destroyed in February. You said that there was a shootout on Sunday night. We need to clarify that it's Easter. And, unfortunately, many people wrote and said that those Satanists who stand on the other side of the barricades from the Russians love to organize bloody provocations specifically on Easter and other Orthodox holidays. All this was well prepared. According to various sources, 3 militiamen died. 2 of them were shot by a sniper. That is, it was a whole military operation. All the news we hear about Ukraine is the desire of a certain force to chaoticize Ukraine, to destroy it as a state. Recently, American high-ranking officials have been frequenting Ukraine. The head of the CIA arrived on a false passport. The last time he came was in 1992, after which he was not interested in Ukraine. Joe Biden arrived today. The program is classified, no journalist. A. Tolstov, there are reports that he will announce technical assistance to Ukraine, including the provision of certain technical know-how that will allow the country to increase the efficiency of its use of energy resources. And Starikov, how many people will believe that Joe Biden flew to Ukraine to talk about new energy-saving technologies? He came because the junta is in a very difficult situation. They did not expect the reaction of their own population, and now they are at a dead end. On the one hand, they would really like to use force, but they cannot do this. On the other hand, they do not want to negotiate so as not to disrupt their own scheduled illegitimate presidential elections. A. Tolstov, at the same time, a number of American congressmen refused to meet with the same Yulia Tymoshenko, who was planning to go to the United States. As a result, she refused the trip. Apparently, she had no one to go to. And Starikov, judging by the number of charter flights of high-ranking Americans, they themselves will soon fly to Ukraine. There is no need for Ukrainians to fly so far. Soon everyone will fly there if the population of the Southeast organizes so actively. A. Tolstov, why then do they refuse to meet with Tymoshenko? Does this mean that she is not considered by Washington as a real contender for the presidency? And Starikov, there may be several options here, one of which you say is that a chocolate candy manufacturer is nicer for Washington. On the other hand, what should I talk to her about? Lately she has been making very strange statements, either to hit her with an atomic bomb or to ask for military help. You and she will sit at the table, there will be journalists and cameras around, and she will blurt out something. You will have to refuse her, diplomatically and gently, so as not to disappoint Ukrainian voters that America is still providing assistance. Therefore, it is easier to get sick, be busy or go on another business trip. A. Tolstov, Vladimir Putin said last week during a direct line that he knows her well, and although she calls for shooting Russians with atomic weapons, according to the president, this was done during an emotional breakdown. And Starikov, the president of a great country must be the most polite person. Vladimir Vladimirovich in this sense absolutely corresponds to this high title. As a diplomat, he speaks in such a way as not to cut off any options. What if, at some twisted turn of history, she becomes the head of Ukraine. In addition, Tymoshenko, who was anti-Russian on camera, essentially signed the gas agreement, which today gives us all the trump cards. The price there is quite high, $486, if I'm not mistaken. There is a requirement for prepayment. If there is no advance payment, we can stop these deliveries. At the same time, she was sent to prison for this agreement. It is possible to say that it brought colossal problems to Russia, but on the other hand, it gave us a great gift by signing this agreement. You see that everything is changing. There was Yanukovych, she was in prison. Now he sits in Rostov-on-Don, and she is in charge. Poroshenko is generally an incomprehensible person. When I was in Kiev, I participated in one of the programs with him. He talked about European integration as usual. The man will be left without sweets, he still has bus production. Everything he produces is sold in Russia, and he wants to integrate into Europe. Now it has become clear that he does not make money from production. Tolstov, the people's mayor of Slovyansk, assured that there are no Russian military personnel in the city. According to Vyacheslav Ponomarev, his former colleagues from the Soviet army came there. This is news from the press conference. The OSCE mission, which is present there, can verify this. And Starikov, they were convinced of this yesterday when they announced that they had not found any Russian military personnel. It's hard to find something that doesn't exist. Tolstov, Ponomarev asked Russia to send peacekeepers to the territory of the Donetsk and Lugansk regions. The foreign ministry immediately responded. Sergei Lavrov said that calls for Moscow to intervene in the situation in the southeast of Ukraine put Russia in a very difficult position. How complex is it? What is the way out? And Starikov, on the one hand, one of the main qualities of a person of Russian civilization is compassion and a sense of justice, so our people, when they shout, "Ours are being beaten," he runs and does not ask who and where. The German will ask, why are they beating, where are they beating, did they call the police? But when we are actively called upon to get involved in Ukrainian affairs in the form of sending troops or some other measures, we need to understand that we cannot help our Russian-speaking brothers in this way. Russia should not send troops to Ukraine. This is what the junta is waiting for, to make us out to be the aggressor, to pit the Russian and Ukrainian peoples against each other. There are a huge number of young people there. Right sector is a grown-up brainwashed kindergarten. All the militants who were detained, including those killed in Slavyansk and captured, are 18, 19, or at most 20 years old. That is, these are boys. Moreover, these are Russian boys. But their sense of justice, which is also inherent in them, is used after brainwashing to fight against their own people. If our troops enter there, these boys will think that they are defending their homeland from the bloody Russian regime, they will fight us tooth and nail. We don't need this. Today, Ukrainians themselves, residents of the southeast, must understand this situation. Unfortunately, blood was shed, but this is not their fault, but those of the bandits who are used as sabotage groups. Only the part of federalization of Ukraine, the part of removing issues that concern the entire population, will help solve the problem. I believe that the constitution of Ukraine should state that the country has 2 state languages. This will immediately remove half of the issues that exist, but neither the Nazis nor the pseudo-authorities are ready to agree to this for one simple reason. If Russian is the second language in Ukraine, how would they prove to the Ukrainians that they and the Russians are different people? The Americans need Ukraine as part of Russia, which they would then set against Russia. In this sense, any military actions by Russia play into the hands of the Americans. Many historians say that Stalin should have struck Hitler before June 22. This is a colossal misunderstanding of the international situation that existed then. If Stalin had done this, then Great Britain, the USA, and Germany would have opposed him. Then there would be a liberation campaign for all of Europe. Radio listener, aren't we too afraid of what the West will think of us? And Starikov, US troops are not officially located on Ukrainian territory. Even the head of the CIA was there incognito and denied it for a long time until they showed him the wig that he had lost on the way to Borispil. They are private structures that were invited by oligarch Kolomoisky. The second question is that objectively they are now stronger, so the one who cannot withstand it should escape from a head-on collision. We have to maneuver. They need to drag us into a conflict, carry out a bloody massacre, declare that Russia did it, and then it may even smell like a military conflict with NATO. In the same way, we were drawn into the World War in 1914. It ended with us helping the Serb brothers, but we were left without our own state. Let's remember the ambassador they are going to send to us. Wherever he goes, there is a revolution, then a coup. By sending such a specialist, they want to play on our internal contradictions, aggravate them through sanctions, through military clashes, and do in Russia what they did in Ukraine. Understanding their game, we must take steps in a direction other than what they want. Radio listener, who can stop the enraged Obama? And Starikov, I also don't like the way he behaves towards Russia and behaved towards Libya and Syria. But remember previous US presidents. George Bush bombed Iraq and killed innocent Iraqis. Clinton bombed Yugoslavia. They are always bombing and killing, and they do it solely in the name of peace. What adds particular cynicism to Barack Obama is the fact that at the very beginning of his political career as President of the United States, he received a Nobel Peace Prize in advance. They tried to please Barack, but thereby put him in a stupid position, because he had already started several wars. Any US president will pursue the same policies. American voters can stop him, but, unfortunately, they will elect someone like him who will fight again. Previously, the aggressive policy of the United States was stopped by the Soviet Union. This did not always work out, but many military conflicts were not carried out by the Americans, because they knew that they would get it in the teeth. Once we restore a strong Eurasian power, we can stop them. That is why they are attacking Ukraine to prevent us from doing this. Tolstov, Yanukovych issued a statement that the new authorities of Kiev need to start negotiations with the people's leaders of the eastern regions of Ukraine. He warns that the authorities are one step away from bloodshed. Will they start negotiations? And Starikov, it seems that they agreed to negotiate in Geneva, but they are not visible. To do this, you need to take a few more steps. People elected their people's governor, elected a new legitimate authority in several more regions of Ukraine. All this brings negotiations with the illegitimate Kiev authorities much closer. They will only talk to those who are strong and organized. There is only one way to solve the crisis. First, constitutional reform, referendums. It is necessary to resolve the issue of language, the issue of decentralization of Ukrainian power. Next, all this should be written into the Ukrainian constitution, after which presidential elections should take place with clear powers and the structure of the state. Yes, the president will change, but who will guarantee that armed nationalists will not come to eastern cities, that they will not kill people? If there are no guarantees, the situation will not be resolved. How Poroshenko and Tymoshenko gave part of Ukraine to Romania. April 27, 2014. History repeats itself if people forget it. The consequences of the fact that people do not remember the events of the very recent past are especially sad. Today in Ukraine a real performance called elections is being played out. The main contenders for victory in the race are Yulia Tymoshenko and Petro Poroshenko. There seems to be a struggle between them. They both make loud statements about the who fight against separatists and terrorists, as today in Kiev they call their own citizens from the southeast of the country. Why is the word struggle in quotation marks? Because both of these figures, Tymoshenko and Poroshenko, are members of the same team. Together we already were in the same government, which, at the command of the West, transferred part of its country to foreign jurisdiction. This happened quite recently. Just 5 years ago. Let's remember how those who today loudly shout about the integrity of Ukraine, at the behest of the West, transferred the Sapontin Island shelf to Romania. By the way, filled with natural gas deposits. So, 2004. Maidan. Victory of freedom, in an unprecedented 3-round election. President Yushchenko, whom the West puts at the helm. It is clear that you always have to pay for Western support. How? Of course, in the interest of your country and your people. Washington, London and Brussels have never helped anyone free of charge in their history. And then the Ukrainian authorities played a combination in 3 moves, which made it possible to pay for Western help in the Orange Revolution. It was decided to transfer part of the Ukrainian coastal zone in the Black Sea into the hands of Romania. Of course, the one that is rich in hydrocarbons. This is the shelf of Zmeny Island. It was decided to formalize the decision taken in advance by the verdict of the European Court. Everything was played out like clockwork. On September 16, 2004, Romania filed a claim against Ukraine regarding the delimitation of the maritime boundaries of the exclusive economic zone and the continental shelf in the Black Sea. When the USSR existed, our Romanian partners, for some reason, didn't even think about filing such claims. But Kukma and Ukraine had nothing to do with it. After all, the first Maidan began immediately, in November 2004. In December 2004, Yushchenko became president after the 3rd round of elections, which has no analogues in world history. Now Yushchenko had to repay the debt. And he gave it. On February 3, 2009, the court announced a decision according to which, if we discard all legal terms, part of the sea shelf of Ukraine went to Romania. Meanwhile, there was absolutely no need to sue Romania. According to a diplomatic agreement signed by the USSR and Romania, Snake Island became part of the USSR from May 23, 1948. Before this, the island became the territory of the Russian Empire in 1829, after another Russian-Turkish war. A state called Romania simply did not exist then. After the Crimean War, our British and French partners transferred the island to Romania. In 1948, it seemed that the end had been reached. In Soviet times, Romania 3 times officially confirmed its recognition of the Zmeny Island and the adjacent shelf as the Soviet Union. Ukraine, as the legal successor of the Ukrainian SSR, could use these arguments. But Maidan's political debts must be paid. And with one stroke of the pen of the Hague judge, Romania regained 79.34% of the disputed territories in the Black Sea, lost due to participation in the war on Hitler's side. The reaction of the Ukrainian government to the decision by which Romania cut off a piece of the shelf for itself is extremely favorable. Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine Alexander Kopchyshin said that Ukraine is satisfied with the decision of the International Court of Justice. It is very important that the last problematic situation in Ukrainian-Romanian relations has been resolved, he said. The line is a compromise, and the court's decision is binding on both sides, the deputy minister noted. Kopchyshin also said that the court's decision was very important, according to which Zmeny was recognized as an island with a territorial sea of 12 nautical miles, 41. Now is the time to see who was the member of the Ukrainian government, which so easily and with a smile gave up part of its shelf to Romania. The president was Viktor Yushchenko. He has long been in political oblivion. But the rest of the heroes of Ukraine continue to fight for votes. And the integrity of Ukraine. The composition of the government of Ukraine at the time the decision was made by the International Court. Tymoshenko Yulia Vladimirovna is the Prime Minister of Ukraine. Alexander Valentinovich Turchinov is the first Vice Prime Minister of Ukraine. Poroshenko Petro Alexeyevich, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine, and others. As we see, everything is together. Presidential candidates Tymoshenko and Poroshenko are now kind of rivals. Illegitimate current IEO. Turchinov was also in that government. Everyone is on the same team. They do one thing. And everything is exclusively for the benefit of Ukraine. So, the first 2 moves, the lawsuit and the loss of the court by Ukraine, have been carried out. Time for the 3rd move, unexpected discovery of hydrocarbons. February 23, 2012, representatives of the American corporation ExxonMobil and the Romanian oil company Petrom confirmed the presence of natural gas deposits on the Black Sea shelf near Snake Island. Fuel reserves discovered in territory previously disputed by Ukraine are estimated by experts at 42 billion cubic meters. This is 3 times the annual consumption in Romania. Please note that Ukrainian politicians gave the West colossal gas deposits, which the Ukrainian economy itself really needs. At the same time, the then Orange government, which today is again at the helm, called the verdict of the court its great victory. Which country's companies do you think will start extracting gas from Zmeny Island? Where will the proceeds go? The fact that it was this country, the USA, that paid for both the Maidan 2004 and the Maidan 2014 is all a random coincidence. It remains only to clarify one question. And where was Arseniy Yatsenyuk during the transfer of a piece of Ukrainian territory to Romania, that today he is so menacingly trying to look at everyone from the TV screen through his glasses? He was not in the government then. He led the Front for Change party. Were you in opposition to the criminal decision? No. He categorically insisted that Ukraine participated in the trial, the outcome of which was predetermined, in order to decide the status of Snake Island by the end of 2008. Yes, I almost forgot. Before the court's decision, Yatsenyuk was also the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Tymoshenko government. And in 2007 he was a great optimist. Arseniy Yatsenyuk added that judicial considerations are ongoing regarding the Zmeny issue. Some of the cases are in court, some of the cases are being considered by commissions. I tell you frankly, we feel absolutely confident in the court case regarding Snake Island. We have hired some of the best lawyers. The position of the Ukrainian side is clear and understandable. Probably, it was these best lawyers who lost part of the territory of Ukraine to Romania. And then Yatsenyuk's party in 2013 joined Tymoshenko's Batkivshchina party. The circle is closed. According to the scenario, the interest and territory of Ukraine can and should be surrendered. If this is done in favor of Europe and the USA. By the way, have you ever thought about why exactly those politicians who were directly or indirectly involved in the transfer of part of the Ukrainian territory to Romania, who read the USA, resurfaced in the murky wave of another turmoil in Ukraine? Why exactly did they receive Washington's support again? And most importantly, what will Poroshenko and Tymoshenko, together with Turchinov and Yatsenyuk, surrender to the states this time? Who do the punishers of Ukraine learn from? April 29, 2014. Today it is no longer a secret to anyone that the Kiev pseudo-authorities are completely dependent. These are puppets controlled by the Anglo-Saxons from Washington and London. It is from their masters that the former putschists, who have now called themselves the Ukrainian Vloda, take their instructions. Twice, special operations against the Southeast began the day after the CIA director and the US Secretary of State arrived in Kiev. One should not be surprised at the junta's almost manic desire to shed blood. It is enough to remember who their teachers are, and the surprise will melt. Almost 95 years ago, on April 13, 1919, the British Empire committed one of its bloody crimes. Today, when the world media is completely controlled by the Anglo-Saxons, they practically do not talk or write about this. And this is what happened. India was a British colony until 1949. Today Ukraine is actually a US colony. On April 10, 1919, there were riots in the Punjab state of India, which were caused by the arrest of the great humanist and great son of India, the author of the idea of nonviolent resistance, Mahatma Gandhi. The British assigned General Dyer to restore order. He decided to act for show. And he actually staged a provocation. Early in the morning, his provocateurs appeared in the city, calling on people to gather for a rally, allegedly organized by the Indian National Congress Party. In the same morning hours, a herald walked through Amritsar and, to the beat of a drum, read out several times the order for the immediate introduction of martial law and the ban on all demonstrations and meetings. In the commotion, few heard the herald, and no one believed him. 43. This happened on April 13, 1919, in the center of the Indian city of Amritsar. On the eve of the Baisakhi holiday, a crowd of unarmed people gathered on the ruins of the Jallianwala Bagh City Park, surrounded by high walls, to express your protest. And many, to have fun and celebrate. According to various estimates, there were from 10 to 20,000 people. The first thing they did was pass a resolution of allegiance to the British monarchy. What happened next remained in history as the Jallianwala Bagh shooting or the Amritsar massacre. English troops entered the park, positioned themselves on a hill, surrounding people who had no way out, they were like in a mousetrap. British General Dyer gave the order to open fire. Without warning. In 10 minutes, 1650 shots were fired. Rifle. Nobody counted the machine guns. 379 people were killed, 1137 wounded. This is according to the book of the French writer Christine Jordi's Mahatma Gandhi, M. Young Guard, 2013. p. 152. The Soviet Encyclopedia writes differently, about 1,000 people were killed and about twice as many were wounded. What is characteristic of Anglo-Saxon handwriting? Setting one part of the people against another. Thanks to this, a few British ruled over hundreds of millions of Indians. The Anglo-Saxons used their experience of dividing the nations more than once in history. India and Pakistan. Cyprus is northern and simply Cyprus. 2 islands and so on. Today they are trying to divide the Russian world, Russian civilization, and the Russian people. Please note, all fascist militants and all politicians in Ukraine speak Russian perfectly. But at the same time, as usual, they insist that they are a different people. In the detachment of General Reginald Edward Dyer, who carried out the bloody massacre, there was not a single Briton and not a single representative of the nationalities inhabiting Amritsar and the surrounding area. And one last question that is worth asking. What did they do to General Dyer, who gave the criminal order? As a result of the investigation, the House of Commons found Brigadier General Reginald Edward Dyer, who carried out the shooting of a rally in the Indian city of Amritsar, guilty of unjustified and excessive use of force and recommended that Secretary of War Winston Churchill dismiss the general. 44. Churchill actually sent the murderous general into retirement with his pension cut in half. But for his sake, a committee was created, to which the military allegedly transferred a colossal sum of £26,317. So the killer was not short of money. How he felt no remorse. Everything is like today for those who give orders to use the army against their people in Ukraine. After all, after their career, hospitable London awaits them. Without conscience and honor. May 3, 2014. The current Kiev rulers and those who replace them have neither conscience nor honor. And this is clearly demonstrated by the Odessa tragedy. Nazi militants from the right sector with their aggressive actions forced people to take refuge in the trade union's house. Then they set the building on fire and did not allow firefighters to extinguish it. The result is about 40 burned and suffocated Odessa residents. What do the main presidential candidates of Ukraine say about what happened? 39. Ukrainian presidential candidate Petro Poroshenko is convinced that the Odessa tragedy is part of the plan of the Russian Federation and Russian special services to destabilize the situation and split Ukraine, his press service reports. Poroshenko expressed sincere condolences to all the relatives and friends of those killed in Odessa and Ukraine. The death of people lies on the conscience of foreign puppet masters, who for several months have been directing, sponsoring and staging pseudo-separatist movements. Attacking and terrorizing real patriots of Odessa and patriots of Ukraine in other regions, he emphasized. 45. 40. Presidential candidate Yulia Tymoshenko arrived in Odessa, where she plans to visit the victims of the clashes on May 2. The website of the Batkish China Party reports this. Late Friday evening, presidential candidate Yulia Tymoshenko arrived in Odessa, where she plans to visit those who suffered during a terrorist attack in the city organized by the Kremlin's intelligence services, the message says. Tymoshenko intends to provide support to the families of the victims who defended Odessa from the separatists, the website reports. Russia is to blame. They always blame Russia for everything. Was it Russia that forced the patriots of Ukraine to make Molotov cocktails and throw them at the building? Did Russia interfere with the rescue of people? Did Russia force the police not to interfere and actually leave the house of the trade unions, leaving the Nazis to finish off people fleeing the fire and smoke? How many of the 4 dozen dead belong to right sector militants and football fans who jointly carried out the burning of people? And how many of those killed with firearms, burned and suffocated were those who were against Bandera and wear St. George's ribbons? Would those who threw Molotov cocktails into the house where people are located, as a result of which they died, be punished, or will we again hear talk that Russia is to blame for everything? You can ask a lot of questions, but there will be no answers to them. Blatant lies, this is the political credo of the main candidates in the Ukrainian elections. In such conditions and such people, it is simply dangerous to choose. Life-threatening. If you want to make a revolution, choose a country that you don't mind. May 5, 2014. I bring to your attention my interview with the Komsomolskaya Pravda newspaper, dedicated to the events in Ukraine, 46. It feels like they are not telling us something, as if deposits of untold oil or diamond wealth were discovered under the territory called Ukraine. Such a battle is going on for it. What's happening? And can it really be that an outpost of the struggle against Russia, as we are accustomed to calling it, could cost so many human lives? And why does such a scenario play out almost without remarks from century to century? A conversation with the writer, co-chairman of the Great Fatherland Party, GF, Nikolai Starikov, was about this. Of the 3 prizes, 2 remain. Judging by what is happening, Nikolai, real Russian people really live in the southeast of Ukraine. They harness for a long time, but they go quickly. Today's events show how correct the actions of the Crimeans were. After all, if it weren't for the referendum, the same thing would have happened in Crimea. Maybe even to a greater extent, because the junta would throw its elite units there. There is a much larger percentage of those who do not want to support the illegitimate Kiev government. Looking at Crimea, the people of the southeast want the same peace. There is a real popular uprising going on there. Miners have no time to deal with nonsense like politics, they have night shifts and slaughter. But what is happening in Kiev gets them not only politically and morally, but also economically. The hryvnia has almost halved in a month, gas prices have risen 1.5 times, and the retirement age will increase. And this current government does not offer anything good, except how to finance the army with text messages. These are political clowns, only bloody clowns, ready to shed blood. That's why people demand federalization. Don't they idealize this concept? No. What is federalization? The ability to solve a number of issues that are key today. People are forced to speak Ukrainian, please, the region decide on 2 languages, Ukrainian and Russian. Or 3, if we are talking about Transcarpathia. Next, economic issues. The region earned money and kept it for itself, what's wrong with that? Gas price, if today Russia does not want, and this is fair, to financially support the anti-Russian, pro-American, fascist regime in Kiev, then we will be able to subsidize the Donetsk or Lugansk region by reducing the price by concluding a separate agreement with a specific region. Now the answer to the question, what does the West need? Chaos. Civil war, bloodshed, destabilization, destruction of the Ukrainian economy. They want it to be bad there. This is important to understand. That is, the West does not lay claim to Ukrainian blast furnaces and coal deposits. He needs these blast furnaces not to go to Russia. Here are 3 Ukrainian prizes. The first is a fleet base in Crimea. The task of the new illegitimate government was to squeeze Russia out of Crimea and transfer this base into the hands of the Americans. It didn't work out. This prize is already in good hands. 2 left. Pipe is a gas pipeline that runs through the territory of Ukraine to the west. Here they are trying to blackmail us, promising to replace Russian gas in Europe with American shale or Norwegian gas. Nothing will work out. Russian gas supplies cannot be compensated for by anything. You need to invest 200 billion euros or build a huge tanker fleet to carry liquefied gas from the USA. That is, in the near future, only plane trees and chestnuts can be cut down in Paris and heated with wood. Finally, the third prize, for which there is now an active struggle, is industrial areas. It is the residents of the southeast who can decide the fate of Ukraine. All repeats. Let's remember why the Russians ended up outside the motherland in the first place. There is a person on our planet to whom you can ask this question. He is alive. This is Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev. So we need to ask him how it happened that a single people, which consists of Russians, Ukrainians, Belarusians and many other peoples who together made up the Soviet Union, suddenly found itself divided by state borders. You, Mikhail Sergeyevich, told us about freedom of speech and perestroika. And look how it all ends. We will not retell the well-known truths that Ukraine as a state practically did not exist before 1991 and that Kiev is the cradle of the Russian state. Centuries passed, the center of gravity moved to Moscow. And the western regions, inhabited by our own people, came under the Poles, the Principality of Lithuania, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and then partially under the control of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The last regions, which today are inhabited by the most Ukrainians, became part of the Soviet Union already in 1939 and after the end of the Great Patriotic War and the Second World War. Within the framework of the Soviet Union, all this was not so important, Ukraine, not Ukraine. But when Gorbachev destroyed the Soviet Union, it turned out that it was already a different country. And the West began to do what it always does, it takes a single people, divides them according to some principle, and then pits them against each other. Great Britain, leaving India in 1949, created two states in the same way, India and Pakistan, dividing them along religious lines. In our case, the division took place along the administrative borders of the Soviet Union. And today the most important idea that Western and Ukrainian propaganda is trying to instill in the people of Ukraine is, you are not Russians. Russia is your main enemy. All repeats. Listen, but the Belivetsky Agreement was signed not by Gorbachev, but by Yeltsin. Why don't your arrows fly towards him? 3 traitors, including Yeltsin, gathered, without any grounds for this, in Belivetsky Pushcha, signed a legally void agreement and announced the collapse of the Soviet Union. What should the president of the Soviet Union have done? To say, you are putschist, we will arrest you, and everything that you signed there means nothing. What did Gorbachev do? He said, excuse me, I am resigning. And forced the Supreme Council of the Soviet Union, again, in violation of the Soviet Constitution, this should have been done by the Congress, to dissolve the USSR. One violation after another. Yeltsin is no less guilty than Gorbachev. But if we are talking about historical parallels, I would like to throw in another idea. Look how similar everything is, February 1917 and February 2014. Everything is the same, freedom defeated statehood, common sense, economics and human lives. It all ended in a colossal civil war, which largely took place on the territory of Ukraine. Why was there all this chaos? Because at that moment there was no stabilizing factor. In 1917, Russia disappeared and was destroyed. And today they destroyed Ukraine, but there is Russia, and therefore you cannot freely shed blood and freely lie. And the West, as in February 1917, supports those who carried out the coup, sponsors the civil war and gives money to the white checks. Only now there is Russia. Therefore, the task of the West today becomes almost impossible. Russian Spring. What should we do? By closing your eyes and gritting your teeth, comply with international standards. Troops cannot be sent to Ukraine. The West only sleeps and sees in order to make us out to be the aggressor. The Ukrainian people must deal with their putschists themselves. I'm afraid that now events there will move with kaleidoscopic speed. We stated that if complete chaos breaks out in Ukraine, we will give our president the opportunity to restore order there. This phrase alone has already kept many hotheads from bloodshed. But the West continues to put pressure on its puppets, and they are trying in every possible way to kill their own people in order to provoke Russia. You cannot give a damn about the norms of international law, because this is the only thing that today restrains humanity from large-scale military conflicts. Our geopolitical friends are just about to dismantle the remnants of international law. Quite recently, if you remember, they bombed states without any UN resolutions whatsoever. Today they can be kept from this, at least in Syria. But let's remember our hockey match with the Americans at the Sochi Olympics. The goalkeeper moved the goal back a little, the goal was scored, but the referee did not count it. That is, the main one in the game is the judge, and the West is constantly taking this role for itself. They will evaluate the actions. Therefore, in a complex geopolitical game, we must not forget that the West is both a rival and a judge. The judging will always be against us. Therefore we must be extremely careful. But experience suggests, if we do something in our interest, the West will always be against it. You were in Crimea on the day of the referendum, March 16th. Which of the emotions you experienced there will you forever write down on your memory card? Feeling of togetherness. It was probably the biggest holiday I have felt in my life. I was happy that I was Russian, that a huge number of people admired my country, that they really wanted to be its citizens and were about to become. This was the victory that we had been missing for a very long time. There is one lesson to be learned from this whole story. We've only been losing territory lately. And now we have finally moved in the opposite direction. The Russian spring begins to unwind. Slowly, surely, in accordance with the mentality of our civilization, which is not at all aggressive. That's when peaceful people, as in Donetsk, are driven to extremes, and they begin to drive tanks across the field. Kaleidoscope squared. How long can all this continue? The Ukrainian police and army either shoot at their own people or go over to the side of the people. Will Kiev stop in its actions or, on the contrary, will aggression against its own people only intensify? I will give historical parallels. When Napoleon landed on French territory, he had literally 100 people with him. The troops sent by the king went over to the side of the emperor. And then Napoleon sent a letter to him, "Dear brother, send more troops, they are all coming to me." The conclusion from this is very simple, the bearer of power is the people. If the people don't want power, it won't hold on. Napoleon represented what the French wanted at that moment. But the king did not personify anything, that's why he ran away. And Kerensky also fled, abandoning the provisional government, in the car of the American consul. He left supposedly for the troops, but never returned. The talk about him running away in a woman's dress is, of course, Bolshevik mythology. But today's Kiev comrades would do well to read his memoirs, since history always repeats itself like a farce. In this case, I do not rule out their escape in women's dresses. News from Ukraine is falling like peas, but 80% of them turn out to be fakes. We have probably never seen such a waterfall of fakes in any information war. What's going on? Do you have any version? A 24-hour working day has been introduced at the American base in Bahrain. Comrades work 24 hours a day, denouncing the bloody regime and supporting democracy in Ukraine. Hence the number of fakes. The already classic phrase, "I am Crimean, the daughter of an officer," was written, as it turned out, by American comrades from Bahrain. Information warfare is a very important component of modern warfare. Do not be surprised that these fakes will appear again and again. Therefore, we must try to put emotions aside. And in addition to outright lies, there will also be simply attempts to distort the essence of what is happening. For example, when talking about the tragedy in Odessa, where dozens of people burned and suffocated in smoke, independent Western and Ukrainian media will talk about the victims. But they won't explain who burned whom alive in the building. No mention is made of the Nazis from the right sector. They will write, "Clashes occurred between pro-Russian activists and football fans. So many people died." Okay, without emotions, what is more profitable for us, to accept the southeastern regions into Russia or to preserve Ukraine within its current borders? Russia needs a united and indivisible Ukraine, prosperous, without tanks on the streets. But the fact is that those who play on the other side of the chessboard, who control these junta puppets with not very smart faces, need chaos. And if, at the request of the United States, they took a course towards the collapse of their own country, then it is very difficult to counteract this. Remember the words of Bismarck, "If you want to make a revolution, then choose a country that you do not feel sorry for." There is irony in the words of the Iron Chancellor, but in fact, our geopolitical opponents are simply destroying states that it is profitable for them to destroy. The Russian Empire in 1917, because it was a competitor. Venezuela, Iraq and Iran, to control oil fields. Ukraine, to squeeze the Russian fleet out of the Black Sea and unleash chaos on Russian territory. Has the situation worsened sharply in recent days? What will happen to Ukraine next? Forecasts are the business of fortune tellers, especially when it comes to human lives. The tragedy in Odessa clearly showed everyone in Ukraine what will happen in their cities if people cannot protect themselves. There is no longer a state in Ukraine. There are scraps of it in different areas: military, law enforcement, economic. But there is no state. Those who carried out the coup in February 2014 deliberately dismantled it. The terrible lesson of recent weeks is this: in Slovyansk people armed themselves and lost several people. In Odessa they were unarmed, and therefore dozens of people were brutally killed. After this, civil confrontation can only intensify, and it is almost impossible to force the Southeast to disarm. There is another point that I would like to draw attention to. During the entire 3 months of the confrontation, about 100 people died on the Maidan, and the West shouted that this was a crime for which President Yanukovych was personally to blame. In Odessa, in one day, 50 civilians, unarmed, died, who did not attack police officers and did not try to seize buildings. The reaction is zero. Where are the human rights defenders? Where are the sanctions? Where is the noise? Imagine if something like this happened in Libya or Syria, who would the US blame? The leader of the country, the government. But in the case when American puppets and direct agents are in power in Kiev, Washington does not notice anything. Odessa, extreme atrocities were needed. May 9, 2014. On the evening of May 8, I was again invited to appear on the air of the Russian news service radio station. The program discussed almost entirely the situation in Ukraine. Here is an excerpt from this program. Ismailov, yesterday's statement by Vladimir Putin. The head of state proposed postponing the referendum in the Donetsk and Lugansk regions. Today we see that they did not reschedule. Why was this statement made? And Starikov, this is an excellent start to negotiations. Russia is ready to influence those who listen carefully to its point of view. If today Kiev is again talking about continuing the counter-terrorism operation, then in Donetsk and Lugansk they are saying that then we will not postpone the referendum. Now information will change very quickly. I do not rule out that colleagues in Donetsk and Lugansk will listen to the president's opinion. But if the situation changes, they may remain with their point of view. This is difficult for the average person to understand because we are all emotionally affected by what is happening. Our president said, "What happened in Odessa makes your blood run cold." But you and I must understand that what happened in Odessa, what is happening in Slovyansk, are all specially organized chess moves, behind which our geopolitical enemy stands. He needed to organize a massacre in Odessa. He needed it to be done in the most brutal way, because they want to provoke Russia into sending in troops. A few facts from this terrible Odessa tragedy. You can organize some kind of fight between people, shooting. People become uncontrollable. People ran into this building. A crowd of heated right-wing fans. Let's say. But in the building, someone strangled a pregnant woman with a cord. Can you imagine an angry football fan strangling a pregnant woman in a building? This is impossible. They can kill each other, someone else, but strangle a pregnant woman with a cord. Why was this necessary? Some extreme atrocities were needed. Specifically, people who had been told in advance that they had to commit atrocities had already entered there. What is it for? So that the citizens of Russia, in horror, demand the deployment of troops there, and the Russian authorities could no longer somehow resist public opinion in this situation. It is difficult to find another explanation for this. People were driven into a mousetrap. These provocateurs were sitting on the roof with red tape. Now the footage is showing everything. They entered through the side door, broke down the door, and killed people. Why didn't the police intervene? Because it was necessary to kill. Ismailov, who is the customer? And Starikov, of course, Americans. Ismailov, performer. These are the teenagers, the girls who prepared Molotov cocktails. And Starikov, there were people who went there to commit atrocities and went to administer, as they understood, some kind of justice. Why did they take cameraman with them? Because this process is impossible to organize. The operators were on one floor, and the most important atrocities took place where there were no operators. What happened there is so creepy and so murky that I'm afraid that you and I will find out the truth in 50 years, and maybe even never, because the Kiev authorities, of course, are not interested in this, but no one asks them. There are very serious Western forces behind it, which, of course, will not allow the truth to be made public now. Ismailov, so the perpetrators are special people who know how to commit such atrocities. And Starikov, either they know how, or they can. I don't know. Perhaps something very bad will happen to them from their point of view, but from the point of view of the higher mind, probably fair, as with Sashko Bailem. Please note that in Ukraine everything is happening very strangely. Sashko Billy shot himself twice while his hands were handcuffed behind his back. Then they say that people in this building self-immolated. There are already images showing that there is no fire there, they are breaking out gunshots. To complete the picture, one statement is missing, to say that the mayor of Kharkov also shot himself with a sniper rifle. Ismailov, they are already laughing and saying, 47. Tragedy in Odessa and the history of provocation. May 12, 2014. The history of provocations has its own history, comparable to the history of mankind. One of the first provocations known to us was the story of the Trojan horse. After all, what provocation is the creation of a certain illusion in someone, which pushes someone to take certain actions. Or to certain assessments of events, that is, misleading him. So the Greeks created the illusion among the Trojans that they had sailed away and left a trophy for the inhabitants of the city. The tragedy in Odessa, where provocation was used in full force, is a striking example of the use of such technologies. Let's remember examples of other provocations that were used to achieve certain political goals. Then the essence of what happened in Odessa will become clear to us. The most famous recent provocation in terms of scale and consequences is the terrorist attacks in the United States on September 11, 2001. The point is simple. The US intelligence services themselves blew up buildings in America in order to get a pretext for invading anywhere in the world to fight international terrorism. With the Al-Qaeda organization. And they fought it for about 10 years. So far, the scenario of American actions has not changed, and now the CIA and Al-Qaeda are fighting together against the bloody regime of Bashar Assad. Do you think you fought each other before? No. The CIA paid, Al-Qaeda blew up the bomb where it was told, and did what it was ordered. Kiev, February 2014. Viktor Yanukovych did not give the order to shoot at people and militants. Then the CIA and its puppets in Kiev staged shootings by unknown snipers in order to obtain the corpses of the revolutionaries. And the reason for the overthrow of Yanukovych. The same scheme was used in Tunisia, Yemen, Egypt, Libya, Syria, and Moscow in 1993. Syria, 2013. Failed provocation. To gain a pretext for invading Syria, US intelligence agencies used chemical weapons through militants and carried out mass executions of civilians in the hope of shifting the blame to the Syrian government. Nothing came of it thanks to Russian policy. Berlin, February 27, 1933. That evening, a fire broke out in the German parliament building, the Reichstag. The police arrived and detained the Dutch communist Marinus van der Lubbe, 24 years old. Other communists were blamed for the arson, and it was used by the Nazis to launch reprisals and ban political opponents. The very next day after the arson, on February 28, German President Paul von Hindenburg, at Hitler's suggestion, signed the emergency law on the protection of the people and the state, which gave Hitler and the Nazis such opportunities. The fact that they could not prove anything did not bother the fascists. The trial of the head of the Bulgarian communist, Georgy Dimitrov, failed, and he was forced to be released. The strange communist van der Lubbe behaved inappropriately at the trial and was sentenced to death, which in Germany was carried out through guillotine. Hitler's hands were untied, and repression began. Despite the fact that the repressions were carried out strictly according to the law. German-Polish border, August 1939. Hitler created the reason for the attack on Poland through provocation. A group of SS men dressed in Polish uniforms and broke into the German border town of Gliwice. There they occupied a radio station, went on air and started shooting, after which they disappeared, leaving several corpses in Polish military uniforms at the scene. Nawa, 1704. In general, dressing in the enemy's uniform is a fairly common military trick. In particular, it was used by the Russian army when it tried to take Nawa for the second time. The fact that the Swedes defeated our army there for the first time in 1700 is known much more widely than events that were more successful for Russia. And this is what happened. Nawa did not give up again. And then Menshikov suggested a trick. The fact is that both the Swedes and the Russians knew that a Swedish detachment could approach the fortress and hit our army in the rear. So Menshikov dressed 2 dragoon and 2 infantry regiments in Swedish uniforms and, with their help, simulated an attack on Russian troops. The delighted commandant of the fortress immediately withdrew the garrison to defeat the Russians from both sides. And he was deceived and captured. So, those who prepared the bloody provocation in Odessa made a hellish combination of various historical examples. The goal of the Odessa provocation is to kill masses of people in a brutal way and provoke Russia to send troops. People opposing the junta. For this. 41. Football fans and right sector activists, other nationalists in disguise, and National Guard soldiers are brought into the city. 42. Some of the militants are dressed up as supporters of federalization, wrapping their hands with red tape and wearing St. George ribbons. 43. A small group of provocateurs attack the marching fans and nationalists and start a fight. Then he retreats under police cover, using firearms. 44. Several dead and wounded fans and nationalists remain on the street. Their comrades saw that the fire was carried out by people with St. George ribbons and red tape. 45. Angry fans and nationalists begin to attack the police and people with red tape, who quickly disappear. The police are also leaving. Militants and fans begin beating and killing anyone they suspect of using weapons. Nationalists also use firearms. 46. An incited crowd can easily be led to the camp on the Kulikovo field, where people with red tape allegedly fled. 47. A threatening crowd marching towards the anti-junta camp forces those who were there, mostly women and elderly people, to seek salvation. The ideal refuge is the house of trade unions. You can control the entrance to it and hold the defense, while numerical superiority does not matter. 48. In fact, this is a trap. People with red tape sat down on the roof of the building in advance so that fans and nationalists would not doubt who was supposedly in the house. 49. People run into the building, and provocateurs on the roof begin to throw Molotov cocktails into the crowd. There is only one point in such actions, to provoke the militants to start throwing bottles at the building. Which is exactly what happens. 50. At the same time, a crowd of militants breaks into the building. Probably, there were also groups of killer liquidators present there who had gone there in advance. To strangle a pregnant woman, who is capable of such a thing? Murders and atrocities begin. 51. What is worth paying attention to is that the rage of part of those who surrounded the house was caused precisely by the fact that they were attacked by people with red tape, and several of their comrades were wounded and even killed with firearms. Many who escaped from the building said that when they were beaten by nationalists and fans, they asked if they were the ones who shot. And they even looked to see if there were calluses on the fingers from the trigger. Thus, football fans were used as cannon fodder. And then they set it on those who were at the House of Trade Unions. 12. The killers in the building acted in cold blood and were aware of what was happening. Their task is to kill as many people as possible. Hence such strange things as a strangled woman and partially burned corpses of people who were deliberately killed and burned. Hence the strange gas that killed people. Either ammonia or a toxic substance. 13. In and around the building there were fans seeking revenge and cold-blooded nationalist killers at the same time. Only this can explain that many escaped from the building and even helped some. And dozens of people were beaten to death by falling from a window and killed in the most brutal manner inside the building. 14. What definitely didn't happen was a coincidence. This tragedy was carefully prepared. But there are still many dark spots in it. One thing is for sure, all provocations sooner or later become public. This is the first. Secondly, Only the defeat of the organizers of the provocation helps to thoroughly reveal what happened. As in the situation with the Nazis. Therefore, the junta will stand until the end. Chapter 5. Aggressive Policy, Made in the USA. U.S. Aggressive Policy. March 12, 2014. On March 5, I gave a lecture to Moscow youth about the aggressive policy of the United States. Educational TV has kindly prepared a text version of the lecture, 48. N. Starikov, good afternoon, dear colleagues. Today we have another lecture dedicated to issues of politics, geopolitics and economics. Today I would like to talk to you about the military conflicts that our American and other American partners have organized in recent times. Because you and I still live in such a very saturated information space, and most young people remember those wars that took place in their memory, and even then, probably, some have already forgotten. And they don't remember the military conflicts that happened a little earlier. Therefore, I think that we should, of course, not remember all American wars. Because this will take us our lives, they have started so many wars. But pay attention to some recent military conflicts, their peculiarities, and remember what formal reasons the Americans used for this. Because you see that today, when the situation around Ukraine is so painful, they are starting to use double, triple, maybe even quadruple standards. They say that Russia is behaving somehow wrong, but they have never behaved this way. Let's remember how they really behaved. I propose to take as a starting point the conflict that those present in the room do not remember very well. Therefore, I would like to ask you a question first. What do you know, dear ones, about the American invasion of Panama? Answer: we haven't heard. N. Starikov, we didn't even hear. Then we will go a little deeper into history to understand why the Americans invaded this country. This is a very small country that has a lot of value. The fact is that, as is known, the Panama Canal passes through the territory of Panama, which connects two oceans. It may be even more important than the Suez Canal. Because otherwise the fleet needs to sail across the entire American continent. And here you can walk along the isthmus. You understand that this is not only a strategic military issue, but also an economic one. So, I would like to recall the history of the construction of the Panama Canal, in a nutshell. The United States of America did one very clever thing when the Panama Canal was built. The fact is that before this state called Panama never existed. The Panama Canal passed through the territory of a state called Colombia. And now there is such a state. True, it has a bad reputation, the production of drugs and guerrillas, who seem to be fighting the production of these drugs, on the one hand, and on the other hand, they are engaged in the production of drugs in order to buy weapons and fight against the United States of America. That is a vicious circle. And it was on charges of selling weapons to this group called the fact that the Americans illegally captured Victor Bout, our citizen, convicted him completely illegally and gave him 25 years. He is still in an American prison, and, unfortunately, there is no way to get him out of there. Since the Panama Canal is a strategic asset, it had to be taken away from the Panamanian people. And here the Americans made such a classic move from today's perspective. In Colombia, suddenly in one of the provinces a movement arose for the separation of this province from Colombia. As you understand, it was in this part of the country that the Panama Canal passed through. And then the desperate residents of part of Panama demanded the creation of an independent state. And of course, the United States of America helped them in this, supported them, and put pressure on Colombia. As a result, the state of Panama emerged, through whose territory the Panama Canal passed. Colombia was left without a canal. The next step was an agreement between the United States and Panama, according to which the Americans received a lease of the canal zone for a very small amount and for a very long period. That is, in fact, the Panama Canal, which passes through the territory of Panama, has a certain extraterritoriality and is controlled by the Americans. And then government officials appeared in Panama who began to question the need for such arithmetic, which was unfavorable for Panama. That is, people appeared who began to say during the elections that the Panama Canal should come under the control of the United States of America. I'll be honest, I don't remember now the name of the person who ran for president and who put forward such ideas. But after some time, all Latin American presidents who tried to defend the interest of their states always died in the history of Latin America. You can take almost any country in Latin America and you will see such amazing facts. Nothing has changed regarding the president of Panama. He also died. They died in different ways. The last president, Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez, as you know, died of cancer. But an amazing thing is that a whole galaxy of precisely anti-American presidents of various Latin American states fell ill with cancer in a very short period of time. Agree, this is a very strange situation. Probability theory tells us that we need to take a closer look. That is, many say that Americans have technology by which they can infect people with cancer. And as a matter of fact, Hugo Chavez, in fact, until his death, blamed the United States of America for his illness. I think that this was not solely his speculation. In a word, the United States is closely watching Panama, and when they felt that the Panama Canal could elude them, and at that moment a certain General Noriega rode there, who, by the way, was a CIA agent who seemed to be selling drugs at the request of the Americans. The Americans landed a small military contingent there. It was a funny operation. You understand that the Panamanian army is a myth, it does not exist. They occupied Panama, captured this general, who was their agent, took him to the United States of America, and gave him a prison term. This is a small American invasion. Next came the invasion of a country called Grenada. 12 US Marines died during this invasion, and a monument is now erected to them. I think that they simply drowned when they jumped out of the ships, because no serious resistance could be given to them by any Grenada. Let's move on to a more familiar time for us, from which point we can start counting. Let's start the countdown with the United States invasion of Iraq. The so-called Desert Storm. It began even before the destruction of the Soviet Union by Gorbachev, but at that moment when the Soviet Union had already actually entered the wake of the policy of the United States of America, and it had nothing against any military operations of the United States. This means that in order to understand the whole situation, you need to remember the following things. Iraq is located in one of the most oil-bearing areas in the world. Nearby are Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Qatar, that is, to quote from a Soviet film, this is a health resort, a granary, and a forge. This is the place where oil and large reserves of oil are extracted, where gas and large reserves of gas are extracted. This territory needs to be controlled. In order to control some territory, what does a racketeer usually do? The racketeer creates problems in order to then sell their solution at a high price. Maybe you don't remember how this was done in the dashing 90s. Guys come and say, you have problems. We can help solve them. If a person doesn't understand, then real problems are created for him. His restaurant was set on fire, or hooligans smashed his car, or he himself was beaten. But as soon as he comes to an agreement with the racketeers, lo and behold, they magically stop beating him, they stop setting him on fire, but he has to pay money for this. The situation is approximately the same for control over oil reserves. That is, you need to create some kind of threat in this region in order to sell your protection and security dearly.